Ah, Yuri, there he is.
I
The man
appreciated the conversation the other day on axiology and your comment I wanted to say on the situation of capital about value seemingly being deeper. I think that's really important and that the commodity form is a manifestation of one form of value. Because there is this question, like a lot of times there's this debate on is value created by the economy or is it pre-existing in nature? And it was very interesting because that's exactly what the conversation on Sunday, on Sunday, Saturday, I don't know what day it is, was about, right? On this kind of question. And I think the issue is that in modern thought, value and virtue are separated, where classically they were not separated. Like if you found something moral, then it was valuable precisely because it was valuable, right? Today, we actually separate questions of economic value or value from questions of virtue, where someone like an Aristotle or something, they would not have done that. They would have said, like, for example, they would have said, well, money has value because it's good, of course. Like, that's why it has value. It's good. If it wasn't good, no one would spend it, no one would use it, right? So, one of the issues that I think has happened for where we have not been very sophisticated about value and virtue is that we've separated them. And we've actually basically assumed that economics can do our virtue for us. If we are a good business person, then we are a virtuous person. If we do good in business, then we do virtues. Now, I agree with Dieter McCloskey. This whole idea that capitalism makes everyone vice and greedy and evil is very problematic. That's not necessarily true. Sure, it can, but the state can do that. Government power can do that. I mean, so, but the question is, and the other thing too that capitalism can do is it can make everyone go to the store and encounter one another who otherwise would not. Like that's one of the that's a really key kind of principle is the intermixing, the kind of mixing. Like why would you ever interact with these people that you see at the store or of other religions or other beliefs unless you are kind of brought out of your home, out of your tribe and you forced to interact. So there's something about capitalism that can actually bring people together. But one of the ways it does that is precisely by getting people to say work or use like prices and money, which of course runs the risk of reducing people to their paycheck, right? So it's always trade off with these things. And that's what we have to think. It's always like capitalism can get you to interact, but it also runs the risk of a reductionism. Okay, well, let's get rid of the reductionism. Okay, well, then people probably aren't going to interact because everyone is too complicated and difficult. And that's the unveiling stuff, because you were also asking in the unveiling, and I'll give it back to you because I know you had questions and different things. And my daughter also told me we need to go on a wild goose chase. So one of these Zooms calls, we're going to get a wild goose and we're going to release it and we're going to chase it because I think that is what philosophy is all about, ultimately, chasing a wild goose in real life, not in the head, because we need to get back to the body and chase that wild goose. So I think Grace has a great idea at the age of 6. We're going to chase a wild goose. I think it's also tied to the question of unveiling, because if you say, well, we need to get out of capitalism and get back to human beings, get to libido or art or different things like that. Well, the truth of the matter is, one of the reasons people went to the commodity form, as Marx calls it, is precisely because the complexity of individuals is too difficult. It's too much. We need to reduce them to understand them. Like we can only handle so much particular encounter. Like you might have like 6 people in your life that are like really deeply particularized. And that's almost as much as the human mind can cognitively handle. But then if you say, well, then everyone else we just won't interact with, well, that seems to be a problem. That's when you get the splitting. But then how do you create a general means of social interaction that is not overwhelming, right? Oh, well, we'll use the commodity form. We'll use the economy. We'll use work. We'll use occupation. And actually what you end up seeing happen is if you don't have people mediating according to a commodity form, they tend to segregate into people who share their worldview. Because I know, oh, you're a Christian. Okay. I don't know your job, but I know you share that. I have a shared intelligibility, right? And so people tend to tribalize into their shared intelligibility, which is ultimately just what Dugan is saying. We may get really angry about it and we may say, no, that's anti-globe and all these different things. Okay, well, do you have a means for people to mediate that can handle the great complexity of individuals without being overwhelmed? No. Oh, okay. Well, then be quiet, right? So that's the issue, like the new address. So to me, the question of the situation of capital, the question of unveiling, like how to handle greater particular interaction or how to encounter interacting with someone that you don't automatically understand them. These are all questions of actually how global pluralism could be possible. And so to me, those things go together. But let me throw it back to you.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts here. So, everybody's
One
applying
is
this metaphysics of difference. This guy is applying it to the nation state. These people are applying it like to techno-capital machinery. So yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so you mentioned value being separated from virtue. And that like Aristotle would never think of that. Well, okay, so um did because I was born in modern times, so I don't know how people lived previously, but like it's hard for me to imagine that like anyone ever cared about something as virtue. Let's say, virtue of sort of like personal responsibility and rhetoric rather than, just the virtue which is being bound to discourse and like, oh, I'm virtuous because I'm behaving according to these rules, right? So like I feel like that this distinction from, oh, now value is separated from virtue feels like only like a linguistic or semantic. Uh, because, like I cannot really imagine that most people ever were working with the spirit of virtue. So that's like one question I have. Um, Another is about the unveiling. And okay, so so the way you describe it is the closer you get to the deeper you get into the particulars, the harder it is to deal with it. And as far as I can understand, you almost liken the particular to the real, right? It's almost as if the like it breaks through the symbolic. It's like the particular is the impossibility, like it like breaks down your abstractions, breaks down your imaginary. um and like so I find it interesting, but and like the part which hit me the most is that good seems to be bound with evil, like beauty seems to be bound with evil, and like um, so in Gothenburg, right, I had this like amazing ecstatic experience, and I was like, I felt like I was touched by God, right? But like it hurt the person closest to me. Like, it hurt her so incredibly deeply. And so it's like, what the fuck? Like I thought this was a gift. I And so I was like, oh no, this is an anomaly, this is an accident. And then like thinking through the way you thought about Dante and Beatrice, right? Like I shifted it as if like, no way, this is actually a metaphysical truth, and like this was not an accident that this happened, but like this actually came with the nature of the territory we were in. Um, and so okay, and now okay, so there's something which binds these two together. And like I'm trying to think, what is it? It seems like there is some kind of weird Zizekian Hegelian twist which I don't fully understand here happening. Something like that is happening. Some like unexpected inversion is there. And another way is like maybe I would understand it through like how I understood Lacan, which like with like this mutual binding which happens there, and like this creates a lot of possibility but also like a lot of fragility.
Yeah.
Sort of. So like is I'm saying a lot of like things here, I'm not really sure. So is fragility inherent to beauty, you know um stuff like that?
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Well, a few things. First off, what's very interesting with the Nick Land-Deleuze connection is it's almost like what ends up happening is the Deleuzian, you could almost say network ontology rhizome, is transferred to technology for Nick Land, and AI then is the carrier of the ontology of Deleuze over human beings, because ultimately Nick, and it's very interesting where then AI is a continual like isomorphic structure of that ontology. But then the question is, will it replace humanity or be an extension of humanity? And this is where I think we need to think Land and Dugan together, because I think also, but that's where simply opposing Dugan or opposing Land is not going to work. It's some sort of art form, some sort of way to think them together to deal with these realities. So I appreciate the Deleuze point you made, and I think it is very interesting. You see, this is what's very interesting about the Deleuze to Land move, is in Deleuze, there's a kind of like everyone is a there's a univocal monad, but it is difference. Everyone is a kind of essential difference as their individuality. So there's something very approximate to Dante in actually Deleuze. And there is something as well that every single ontology cannot be captured because it's a certain one of one, and that the relations are more virtual, and that is all quite beautiful. I think Deleuze's ontology is beautiful. Difference and repetition has a lot of beauty to it. And actually that gets at how you can have difference, particularity, and hierarchy, if you will. If hierarchy is bound as you move to the particularity, you get a particularity that is fundamentally different. And in particularity, there's a radical difference in that particularity, but also universal because everything is particular. So everything is a particular difference, right? And I think that's basically virtue and value occurs when you begin to scale, because virtue then becomes a simile for law, and you have to bind people up legally and call that virtue. What ends up happening is following the law becomes being virtuous. Where in the classical mind, someone like Achilles is actually virtuous. You say, what? I thought he has rage. Well, of course, all virtuous people have a great vice. That's because they're virtuous. They have great power. Virtue and power are strongly connected. Like the virtuous would be the one who's wonderful, or who you see and they shine. They're graceful, the great man, the battle, the soldier, the great artist. Virtue was much more akin to shine, as you would talk about in a kind of Hegelian sense. It was that thing that you would see and go, oh, that it has an aura, almost in a Walter Benjamin sense. What has happened now is virtue means you followed the dogma, you followed the principles, you followed the law. Now, the movement from virtue being an individual acknowledgement of greatness, which, by the way, notice would require a communal life to see that individual pertness and to witness and to be able to interact with them. As you move to a larger and larger scale, virtue begins to transform into law. You could say virtue, dogma, law, if you will. Dogma is not quite as like international law, but dogma is more like a big community where there's a lot of moving parts, and we can't not everyone's going to see everyone or know everyone, and not everyone's going to even agree on what constitutes greatness. And so now we have to move to a dogma to help people, because the other issue is to have virtue be a shine. You basically need everyone to agree on what is a shine, right? Like, like Hannah Arendt talks about the movement from Greek to Christianity. In the Greek mind, pride is a virtue. Like, it's actually a virtue. Humility is a vice. And then Christianity comes along and suddenly humility is a virtue and pride is a vice, right? Well, that sort of shift makes it very difficult to have virtue as shine. Because then when someone's shining forth with their pride in battle or art, you interpret that as a vice, right? Whereas before, if everyone shares the notion that pride is good, then shine is much more intelligible, right? So as you get disagreement on what constitutes virtue, ergo shine, because the other thing with shine, as I'm describing, it sounds vague, but it isn't, in no more, because you feel greatness. Like when you're in the presence of, say, a great musician or artist or the president of the United States, it's not mental at all. You feel oh my gosh, it's a celebrity. Oh my gosh, it's one of those people, right? There's a kind of shine that comes forth that is not abstract at all. It's incredibly concrete when you experience it, right? And you would say, oh my gosh. What's very interesting is what we call a celebrity today. The meeting of a celebrity is the phenomenology of the experience of shine. But the problem is we don't associate celebrity with virtue, because a celebrity tends to be market forces manipulation. Whereas if you had that same phenomenology in a bound local communal experience, the feeling of a celebrity would be much less much less questionable as immoral or manipulative or stupid, right? Today, the problem is when you get that experience of a shine, it comes with they're just a shallow celebrity because we know they game the system, right? Well, back then, if you're encountering a soldier who on the battlefield did something great, there's no question that that experience of shine is actually emblematic of something great, right? Because you can't be shallow to win a battle. If you win a battle, you must have had what it took. But you could be theoretically a musician artist today who's a celebrity. That's a celebrity because they were shallow. That's how market forces work, right? So now it's much more difficult for us to connect shine and virtue because we have these counterfeits of shine. And counterfeits, and I'm not saying every celebrity is, well, let's put it this way. It's ambiguous. There are some great celebrities. I'm not saying, like, if I met I think Christopher Nolan's a tremendous director. You would feel that shine, but that same experience of pinned down, maybe as a Sartre would say, or something like that, is also mixed in with other celebrities and big names that maybe have gamed the system, right? So it becomes ambiguous. And when it becomes ambiguous, it cannot be a concrete or reliable source of an identification of virtue. Because it's ambiguous, right? Whereas in the classical mind, when it was more locally bound, that experience of shine would be more reliable. Ergo, it could be the basis of a virtue order, of a moral order, of a society, because you could trust it. Now, you can't trust it so much. And so we have to turn to something else. Well, what do we turn to? We turn to dogma and law. Now, law, okay, we can't rely on shine because it's too easy to manipulate on the global scale or in mass media, TV, and all that. So we're going to rely instead on law and dogma and right and wrong. Well, at that point, the experience of virtue then, because you then naturally conflate law and virtue, becomes very different from the experience of value. Whereas back then in that local setting, the experience of shine was very strongly tied to a sense of this is valuable, this is good, this matters, right? But now the feeling of I value this and the encounter with the celebrity feel very distinct. Right? You might just be nervous and anxious over here, where encountering your grandma's like vase or something is over here. They're separate, right? So as you have globalization and you move apart law and virtue, you likewise make ambiguous the phenomenology of shine. Therefore, it can no longer be a reliable basis for a social order. You have to fill the void. You move in the direction of dogma, then law. And once you move in the direction of law, then virtue and value are separated. And once they are separated, they don't seem to have anything to do with one another. Economics swoops in and says, well, yeah, because value is the commodity form. The government swoops in and says, well, yeah, of course, because virtue is law. Now they're separated. Now we're not able to address Dukin, because you must be able to address the conditions of the individual to bind one another organically, like the Dante dance, by the creation of shine, which requires the cultivation, like we were saying last time in terms of education, to actually be able to observe that and not be reliant on something external like law or dogma or the nation state or things like that. But at the same time, you're operating within it. So the separation of virtue and value, which another way to put this is in the past, ethics and aesthetics were strongly connected. Like the experience of the good was aesthetic. It was beautiful. It was orderly, because you would see the great artist, you would see the great soldier or the great person, and it would have an aesthetic strike to it. It'd be like a work of art. Now, aesthetic and ethics are separated. And when that occurs, ethics becomes much more legal. It becomes much more legal. Now, this is also tied strongly to this problem of goodness and evil being connected. Because what ends up happening is when you encounter a great person, it always entails a judgment. You look on yourself and go, why haven't I done more? Why don't I have more? When you encounter something beautiful, you're like, why do I live in an ugly house? Why don't I have art? The experience of goodness always has a reflective activity where you reflect back. Or you also go, man, you had that beautiful experience, but I didn't have it with you. Why didn't you share it with me? Also, when someone goes into beauty, it feels like they're differentiating from you. Like they're going and they're becoming a deeper spiritual being or having a deep spiritual experience. And there's an interiority now that you can't access that person now has. And so there's a hurt in that. There's a hurt in the separation. And you see, the issue is that when the experience of the aesthetic as ethical was local, you were doing it more often. You had regular experience of it and you could see it occurring. Also, you wouldn't meet a global celebrity or a global artist, or you probably would not have psychedelic experiences that you could not access. There were probably with Plato and Socrates and some of the Heraclitus, there were probably psychedelic experiences as well. Well, those were contained in the religion of the day. Those were things that people would go through. They might have aging processes and so on and so on. So it was integrated into the social order. So it really wasn't something that you could choose as an individual to do and leave your spouse behind. You may be brought into it if you're going to be part of the priesthood. It was socially structured to not feel like a choice where you chose to have a spiritual experience that then separated you from the people around you so they could take it personally. Because people can take personally things you individually choose, but they do not take personally things that are socially constructed or organized. So if the social order is organizing you to become, to differentiate according to greater spiritual experiences or going on the battlefield or different things, that's easier to live with because you say, well, of course they did. That's what the town, that's what the community demands, right? But in a world that is free or more globalized or different things, then everyone's experience to enhance, say, their truth or to enhance their goodness or to enhance their beauty feels like an individual choice. And then people are going, why did they choose that instead of choose me? You see, why did they choose that versus choose me? Like another way to put this, in the past, if maybe we could take Mulan, right, where the emperor rides in and says your father has to go to war. Oh, okay, you can't get mad at your dad if he goes off to war. Maybe he goes off to war and gains a lot of honor and he comes back and has a great shine, right? You would be like, oh, well, he responded to his duty, came back with a shine, so I can't resent him for that shine. But if you today say, I'm going to go fight in the Middle East, it's like, well, there's no draft. No, I just want to go. Well, why do you want to leave us? Why do you want to go? So even if he goes off and gets a lot of honor, he comes back and you actually resent that, right? So whenever you have individual choice, the gaining of shine is more likely actually to create resentment because there's not the social structure to send people off and cushion people from those choices, right? And also, you can have shine that's kind of globally magnified now. Whereas in the past, maybe everyone in the community was like, oh yeah, John here, he fought in the war and was a great soldier. Oh yeah, he's a great blacksmith. Now it's like, oh yeah, he's known all around the world, right? So that actually intensifies the power of the shine, or can intensify the shine, exactly when you have less buffers to handle any shine at all. So you get the worst of all possibilities coming together. You have people who are potentially going off and having these incredibly unique situations with people all around the world, or very intense, or maybe they become celebrities and have shine because they're globally recognized. And you have that intensity precisely when you don't have any social mediation. It's just an encounter of individual choice, right? So there's no mechanisms of unveiling. And so you experience that with envy, with resentment, with trolling, with hate, with all of these different rages. You see these people do these great essays, and the only thing you can talk about is how they, they're a Nazi or how they did something evil, right? You don't read these great canons of work. You look for the thing to cancel them over, right? Because that is a natural response to encountering something vast that you don't have mechanisms of handling, and so you need to cut it out. Because if your society does not have mechanisms of unveiling, it deconstructs. That's the only way to handle the beautiful. It has to undermine it because it can't handle it. So you have to cut it out and you have to destroy it. And so resentment then becomes a kind of, the Nietzschean resentment becomes a rational direction for people to go in where there are no social mechanisms of unveiling. Because what else can they do? Because an encounter with the beautiful automatically has a sort of judgment in it. And if someone's judging me, there's either two things. There's two responses when I'm judged by something great. I rise to its occasion, or I find out why it's not great. I undermine it, or I rise to its occasion. And if I'm I'm low on time energy, I don't even know where to start, then it doesn't even seem to be an option to try to rise to its occasion. The only option that seems to be there is to deconstruct it and to cut it out, right? So the unveiling, and that problem that we just highlighted, with the separation of aesthetics and ethics, the separation of value and virtue, and then the lack of social mediation to handle experiences of virtue, all come together to make the only valid political economy either basically Dugan or Deleuze at this point. That's what it seems like, because you need to be able to think about the encounter on a global pluralism that wasn't reliant on the state would have to require people to encounter difference as an invitation into greater shine. But that means they would have not to resent the difference. They would have to see it as an invitation. Well, that's a development of the subject. Now we're talking Hegel. Now we're talking cultural mediation, education, and different things like that. So those are some ways. I'll give it back to you. There's more to say, but let me give it back to you.
What I hear here is Girard, right?
Yes.
And so I am like, I think there is like a few points which you made, which is like not necessarily clear if it goes towards the better or worse. Because like, let's go back, for example, to your example of Greeks and then Christianity, right? Like, Greeks were all killing each other, and there was pride and there was shine, right? But they were also, the closer you are, the stronger the mimetic rivalry gets. But then the idea, at least that's how Girard interprets Christianity, is like, oh, it was able to sort of stifle that rivalry, right? Like put like an end to it. But then we don't get heroism, basically. We don't get shine. And so you're basically talking about that problem. And like you are, if I understand it correctly, you are asserting that there is some art of unveiling which we would like to be able to solve the you know the problem of greatness of mimetic rivalry and to help people deal with it. And the best we've got so far is just avoiding dealing with it with prohibition time, right? Like that's the best we've got so far. And so you say, okay, well, if it's a social structure, it's easier. Like if a social structure supports somebody's shine, it's easier to deal with mimetic rivalry because it doesn't reflect on you as an individual, right? Because then it's not their individual choice, and therefore it makes the entire thing easier. But now we're a society of individuals, and like it's so. But again, like also there's like a social component to it, right? Like all these fucking rappers and gangster rappers or whatever, right? Like they're still like it's, oh, we're individual, but also it's like a very socially conditioned individualism. So it also in a sense helps us deal with it. To your point about celebrities, um like you could argue that they're closer than ever, but you could also argue that they're more distant than ever, and therefore it's easier to deal with their shine, right? Because like it's like, oh, just someone out there, and like sure, yeah, I'll just troll on fucking YouTube comments or whatever, but like who cares? Like it's like a great sublimation of all the murderous instinct there.
Yep.
And they are so far from like our personal life that it can decrease conflict.
Yep.
Okay, let me see my notes. But yeah, and so I mean, I guess the main question which you posited then is like, how do we not resent the difference? How do we not resent the beauty? And I'm like, like I can see this exactly what you're talking about phenomenologically in my life, where like I see beauty so often, and I wish I was that, and then I feel jealousy or envy towards that, and it's so insane how you can, and it gets to the point of like, uh, it's like hard to appreciate others because of it. Um, and I think this sort of connects to, maybe you could call it recognition, or what Barth calls exhibitionism and voyeurism, where like it's yeah, art and you know shine, I guess, is all about exhibitionism and voyeurism. And to me it almost seems that like, because I want to, like I feel like an exhibitionist so much, I want to be seen so much, and I don't care about seeing. To me it seems like voyeurism is the ultimate virtue, because you're the one who sees others shine.
Oh, absolutely. So a few things come to mind. First off, I I think it's been a massive mistake to think of judgment as an activity of a judge metaphorically. Like, you know, if we're talking like Christianity, I think the best understanding is if you are a sinner, then the very presence of God is a judgment. It's not that God, say, points his finger at you and says you're a sinner. The very presence of goodness makes you reflect on yourself, and that's hell, right? So that's an example of the dynamic that when we're talking about this unveiling, and I think unveiling as we're describing it has a lot to do with what we talked about last time on education and how people are educated, and not the subjects of education, but the mediums of educated. Like, what does it mean to be truly toward a person and different things? And this thing keeps popping up. I'm sorry. I don't know why it keeps doing that. Sorry about that. So you need to update your computer. No, because once I update it, it will never work again. So I will push this off as long as possible because it works great now, and I don't want to update it. So stop telling me. Anyway, I'm sorry. I love also when I come back the next day and it updated automatically, and I'm like, no. And now I can't put it on sleep without it crashing. I'm like, great update. So anyway, so you see, the issue is that the tendency of thinking of judgment as I broke the law, so I'm going to prison, leads to an association of right or wrong versus, oh, I need to condition myself to be in the presence of greatness, or else I'm going to feel judged by that greatness. We've actually separated envy and jealousy and all these things. Those are feelings of judgment. Those are feelings of resentment against the judgment. They're all connected, right? But if you don't connect those things together, then what you do is say, oh, I shouldn't feel that way. I shouldn't be envious. I shouldn't be jealous. So on and so on. No, you're going to be if you're not conditioned to handle goodness and beauty. It's going to occur. So what you have to do is create, in my opinion, as you know, I talk a lot about the classroom, you have to create regular experiences of gradually in an unmediated form coming against great thought. You're going to feel resentment. Well, let's try again. Let's do it again. Okay, let's do it again. And you create basically training to emotionally habituate yourself to encounters with that greatness or conversation of beauty, to where you get to the point where you recognize, wait a minute, the fact I feel envy does not mean I've broken some sort of moral law. It means that I haven't conditioned myself yet to be able to handle this thing. So let me try again. And you start sublating the feeling of envy as a call on you to practice your life in a more wonderful way, to raise yourself to the occasion. Because what we do instead is we take the feeling of envy as evidence that we are like sinful, in the sense of there's something wrong with us. And what we do is repress. When the correct response to envy is to get better. But the problem is, because the classroom, if you will, or the social order of the family does not create small little experiences of envy to where you can work with that feeling to stop letting it, you then are released as an adult into the wild. You've had no way to habituate to the feelings of jealousy and envy. So therefore, when you feel it, it's very powerful. You're likely to go in the direction of resentment, as opposed to see it a call on your life to raise yourself to a higher occasion, because school never told you to do that. All school ever told you was to learn. So why would you think to interpret these emotions as evidence to get better? To get better at an art, to learn how to talk? Like, why would you think that? Because you have not been given those associations. And so, like just an example of what unveiling would mean, it would mean, okay, we know that kids are going to feel jealousy or inadequacy when they encounter a great person. That's going to occur. How do we, between the ages of 8 and say 18, gradually have them encounter greatness in a manner that they can handle, and then not feel bad for feeling inadequate or jealousy, but say, no, that's kind of the expected emotion when a human being encounters greatness, because greatness inherently entails a judge. And how do we work with that for you to interpret that as evidence to get better, not evidence to cower up and become a last man, if you will, right? But that would require a classroom that would train you to interpret that experience in that manner. But instead, we interpret judgment as, I did something wrong. I'm in the wrong. I'm a bad person. Well, then all you say, well, don't feel envy. Don't feel envy. Don't feel it. You can't just not feel envy. You have to work, gradually unveil yourself to more and more greatness, so that the judgment of greatness no longer strikes you as something that causes envy, but something that causes inspiration. That's what you have to train kids to do. The same phenomenon that causes envy is the same phenomenon that causes inspiration. So the question is the following: how do you train kids to experience greatness, or people in general, in terms of inspiration versus envy? A gradual process of habituation and exposure. That's how you do it. We do not have that in the social order. Like in the past, another way to think about it is kids got this from the stories of their elders. They were around old people. The community had stories of greatness. People would listen to it and go, oh my gosh. And the way and Tim was talking about this the other day. In the past, what would happen is education was mostly a guy told the kids stories. And then he sat back, and here's the difference. He didn't ask them what were the main characters, what did the story mean. He waited to see how the kids responded to the story. Very big difference. Because when the kids respond, you find out, if they say, like, let's take Lord of the Rings, right? I tell the Lord of the Rings and I sit back. I don't ask them questions like, who was the main character? What was the theme? I just sit back and say, so what did y'all think about that, kids? And some of the kids over there say, wow, it turns out that the little people can actually be the bravest. Oh, okay. That's inspiration over there. But another kid says, I would have kept the ring. Ah, that's envy over there. We need to focus on that kid. We need to tell them more stories, right? So based on how the kids respond to the story, you can get an identification of what kind of unveiling level they're at, what is their response to envy, and then you can work with those kids individually based on the response to that story. But if instead you ask the kids, what were the main characters, you have no idea where they're situated. All the kids who are envious and think you should keep the ring, and the kids who think Frodo would, but they all give the same answers. So you have no sense of where they're located in their development. And so you just set them off, and then lo and behold, we have no way to stop mimetic desire at all. Because mimetic desire is what rationally follows from when you encounter greatness. When you encounter something great and valuable and good, you want it. You want to be like it, right? Mimetics is the mechanism of inspiration. When you encounter something you want to be like, it inspires you. Mimetics is neither good nor bad. It depends on how it is used and how it is trained. And the issue is mimetic desire that goes in this very problematic way that needs a scapegoat is what follows when you have a social order that doesn't have mechanisms of unveiling, that doesn't have mechanisms of habituation. Well, then then the only option we got is some sort of freaking scapegoat. And, Jurij would say, well, yeah, that's been the sacred violence of all of history. Yeah, you're correct, but now we're in global pluralism, and it requires something else. It's just like Dr. Hammerwick talks about all the time, where now you have exposure, you have prehistoric instincts on global exposure, right? So mimetics are going wild, and you have these reversals of taking on the scapegoat in order to get identity, and all of these new ways, these kind of post-Girardian dynamics of the same dynamics of Girard, but taking on these kind of ironic twists and things like that. Well, none of that's going to stop. And none of that will stop unless you expose kids to mimetics in a way that makes them inspirational versus rivalrous. But that requires a different way to get kids attuned to that experience of mimetics and envy, to where they see it's actually kind of healthy to be a being who may experience envy when you see something good, right? Like, I wish I had that. Wouldn't it be kind of worse if they felt nothing when they experience good and beauty, right? The very fact they feel envy is actually evidence of a potential good, because they feel something, right? The question is how to train that so that it becomes inspirational versus possessive. But it becomes very difficult to do this when you don't have elders telling stories, when you don't have communities that are sharing traditions and history, because there's no narrative that I can be inspired by to rise to its occasion. I think also, I just wanted to say on the celebrity point, that's exactly right. Celebrities at a distance, it can be easier to cut them off all their close because they're on social media. The point is that the experience of the celebrity is now ambiguous, and therefore the phenomenology you can no longer readily associate with an experience of virtue. Like, the experience of the celebrity is no longer reliable. Whereas in the past, the experience of the celebrity, the town hero in the shine that came, had a less ambiguous meaning. Now you can't trust it, so you have to look to something else. And what else do you look to but law? That's what ends up happening. You then turn to law because you can rely on that to determine good and bad. But then, of course, the question is, who writes the law, and what do you do when the law is used to create injustice? So then it all becomes ambiguous, and we're looking for an alternative, and we don't have it. The alternative would have to look like the ability of people. Well, you just take, this is what I basically am arguing. Envy is a widespread emotion. It's everywhere. It's constant, just like Girard said. Well, guess what? That means the material for a society of inspiration is actually there. You don't have to force it. You don't have to press it on people. It's there. The emotion of which can lead to inspiration and people rising to the occasion to become subjects who can handle difference is there precisely because you see jealousy and envy. That is the emotion that can be directed into inspiration, but you're not going to think that if you don't understand that the very experience of goodness is judgmental. That's the key. If you think judgment is separate from the experience of goodness, then you'll say, well, envy and jealousy, these are not good materials. These are bad things. So we need to get rid of them. No. This is the very, at its core, is an emotional reaction that is the very material that exists at scale in many, many people that can be used to direct people toward mimetics of inspiration. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, the reason why this point, and I'll give it back to you, the reason why this change in a philosophy of judgment is such a big deal is because if you ask the question, how do we get everyone to do good? And it's like legal or whatever, well, it's impossible. Like, it's you're never going to get the majority of people to do it. But if instead you say, Well, judgment, the good, the very existence of mimetics and jealousy and envy and all of those things mean that people do, on average, identify something valuable. They do, in fact, identify something virtuous. That's why they want it. Oh, that's great. How do we then train that to be an inspirational or co-creative relationship versus a taking or depressing or destructive relationship? So you have the material there in that very emotional experience to direct it towards something that is more sustainable. But if instead you're saying, well, how do we get everyone to believe the right, let's put it this way. If you say, how do we get everyone to be philosophers? It's not going to happen. Not in this, like, how do we get everyone to read Heidegger? Not going to happen. How do we give everyone the right ideas? Not going to happen. How do we give everyone the right social conditions? Not going to happen. Most programs for making a difference in this sense are some sort of adding something to people. The moment you talk about adding something to people, well, then you have to have the system of distribution, resources, and you're probably going to be forcing upon them your own worldview. You got all these different problems, right? But if instead you say, how do we train people to interpret the emotions they already have in a different way? Well, that's very possible. Like, everyone has the emotion. It's simply the educational program is the interpretation, not just this, but it's a core principle, is about the interpretation of that emotion as actually a good thing that says they have the material they need to be inspired. But that becomes something then you have to bring to people's attention, right? And that's where, to me, the Christian conception of beauty is dangerous, joy can kill you. Pride is actually a sign of wanting to be something. Pride is actually the possibility of being honorable, misordered, right? All bads are misordered goods. All goods can be misordered bads. Well, you've got that, then you're not going to assume the existence of envy is evidence of everyone is in the bad. What you're going to say is everyone has some sort of misordered good. And the question is, how does it get ordered? Oh, mimetics is actually the material for inspiration. And then you focus on that in different ways. But let me give it back to you.
It's resonated, but I am not sure. Like, it still feels like additive, right? Like, it still feels like, oh yeah, sure, you have something, but as soon as you need people's attention for something, it's already an investment. So it
But
comes
this
back.
actually, no, I'm glad you said it, because this is why actually on Sunday is a big deal. Do you think value is inherent to the human experience or not? If you say it's not, then it's additive. Everything I said is additive. If you believe that humans have an innate tendency to recognize something of value or good or beautiful and true, and then interpret their relation to it or decide their relation to it, then it is actually part of the structure of being itself. Does that make sense in what I just said? This is why there's a lot at stake in the question of axiology. Like,
Well,
please.
well, like, so I see what you're saying, that like there's a difference between, oh, this is something inherent, and oh, we need to like do something correctly or right in order to, like, make things work, sort of. And but what I'm saying is, I think this distinction is actually collapses,
Mm,
in that um both of those require attentional effort.
mm.
Like, however you frame it, it's still attentional effort. So I don't like, I can see why one metaphysic might be more productive than the other. But I don't see how the inherent value one solves anything. Like, so everything you're saying like resonates really deeply on a personal phenomenological level, and I can see how it will improve my life. But for fuck's sake, I have no idea how, it could do something in general. And this is what I was thinking also when I was listening to you on, like this non-rationality thing, like, and how to deal with all these things. Like, it actually sort of described how I lived my life for the past few years, like trying to deconstruct these things and open up possibilities of freedom and different behavior, right? But holy shit, I'm crazy to the people who I'm surrounded by, and like I like it seems to me like the more I'm like living my life, the more it seems to me like I'm just a weird shamanoid character or something like that, and less of like a person, you know? Just like it seems it like I think the capacities you're talking about, they feel to me so extreme that it just like doesn't make sense. Like it's so extreme. Like it's not actually just something you can teach people.
Well, there's two questions. No, it's excellent. And thank you for looking at the series. So first off, there's the question of, is it probable that everything we have just been saying is going to be implemented at a global scale and save the world? No, it is not probable. History is a long story. So just to get that out of the way, it is not probable. History is a long story. Like we were saying, the owl of Nineveh flies at dusk. Like history is a story where the key line that's kind of trite, but I think it actually, in a way, explains why history repeats, is that ideas are not experiences. Like ideas are not experiences, and the majority is shaped by the experience of a bad thing. If I say this is bad, it is a very small amount of people who won't do it. The majority will need to do it to see it's bad, and then they'll stop. That's basically why history repeats, is that a minority of people can be convinced to change their behavior based on an abstraction, where the majority of people cannot change their behavior unless a direct experience. And that's why history repeats, because we're not going to change our foreign policy until we go to war with China or something. The minority of people would say, hey, if you keep doing this, you're going to end up in World War III, and they would change their behavior, but the majority are not going to follow experiences. So the big problem is that ideas are not experiences. They seem like experiences, but they're not. And that's because ideas do not create the same. Most human motivation is a product of emotion. And ideas do not create emotion like experience. Like if I were to talk about divorce, you don't feel the experience the same way that if you have a divorce. Pretty obvious, but that goes to show you why there tends to be, you could say, an elite class versus, and the elitism is not based on some sort of necessary higher intellectual capacity. I know a lot of blue collar people who actually are more likely to listen to ideas than intellectuals, because there are lots of intellectuals who can rationalize, why they don't need to follow that idea until the experience, and that's actually the tiebreaker. That's a funny thing. Being smarter may mean you're just able to deny an idea until the experience, and then you're forced to change. So it doesn't necessarily follow that just because you're better at philosophy means you're less likely to fall into the mistake of only being changed by experience, because you can always just deny the idea. So this is not necessarily saying that taking philosophy will make you avoid this mistake. There is some characteristic where there are people who are able to actually give the same authority to their behavior in ideas versus experiences, but that tends to not be the majority. So right there, that poses a problem. But all that said, if you buy everything that is being said, then you may raise your children differently. You may, if you're a teacher, may teach differently. You in your own personal relationships may do things differently. And also, if you're, say, going to something like Philosophy Portal and everyone thinks you're wasting your time, because you've had these conversations, it's easier to have confidence in this thing that no other one understands. Because you can't separate how you live your individual life from your macro view. Like if you think, like how you view the world, if you think capitalism is best, Marxism is great, or whatever, that will trickle down into your lived experience, into your daily life. So that's one of the things. Like when we have these conversations about the big picture, what the classroom needs to do, there's the question of, are we talking about that so that your particular life can be an image and likeness of that macro vision that you've been convinced as an idea is best, because you can't experience it. It can only be an idea, but that idea could change how you experience your individual life. It could change how you do things and how you're more confident in your choices. Because the thing is, what we're talking about, basically, if we take that category of non-rationality, it is insanely difficult to do non-rational things without social support, right? And basically, you need that regular philosophical discussion to give yourself confidence in that. You can never have certainty, but to get the confidence to stick to it and know that it is best requires a whole lot of constant discussion about these things. Because another way to look at philosophical discussion is a check to make sure you're not crazy, because you feel crazy. You're like, am I crazy? Okay, I'm glad. Okay, no, I'm not. It just feels that way, right? Like if you don't have that regular checkup, you're probably going to fall back away from it and give up on it, right? And the only way to also then feel more confident in your individual particular non-rational choice is to have a macro worldview in which it is situated and justified, right? If you don't have that, if you're just feeling like I'm using philosophy for individual personal decisions, yeah, at the end of the day, that's the Scottish Enlightenment. I'm all about that. But the issue is you will probably quit if you are not able to ultimately justify it as being situated in a macro picture that, yeah, maybe the whole world won't do it. Maybe no one, what the likelihood of people doing it is like zero, very low. But if you don't have that, your own ability to be confident in your own life choices, ways of living and things that you do is probably fragile. Like you need to talk about the macro to not be fragile in the micro is another way to put this. Actually, the macro can make you more anti-fragile in the micro. And in the same way that we were saying, I was saying the classroom needs, we do this for our own children. Like if our children feel envy or angry, I'm not going to say there's like, there's something wrong with you. I'm going to say, hey, that's a misordered good. That means you recognize the good rather than be wanting to destroy. When you see, the example I use is like when you see a sandcastle, don't you feel a weird urge to kick it and destroy it? Yeah. Like, what do you think that is? It's like, I don't know. I just want to destroy it. It's like that feeling, take that feeling to instead be inspiration to build your own sandcastle or to make something great and beautiful like that sandcastle. That feeling of destruction is precisely the same rush of a feeling that can be inspiration if you don't give into the temptation to kick the sandcastle. Like the Christian concept of temptation at its best is to use a good for a bad end. Envy in its core is an emotion to relate to the good. So use that in a good way versus fall into the temptation to use it in a destructive way, right? But what you're trying to do is say, hey, you shouldn't feel like you broke the law, the big other, no. That feeling of envy is actually in many respects a healthy thing. It just has to be ordered, right? And then when other parents, for example, are like, that's crazy, why would you even teach that? You have the macro worldview and understanding of how things operate to not cave, to not apologize, to actually stick to your guns per se. And so those are how those kind of things connect. Yeah, so that's very important. So you have to kind of talk about the macro to be confident in the micro. And that's
a very important point because like, especially because we are very isolated. And so like some semblance of a social structure actually really helps.
Yes.
Even if we imagine this social structure ourselves, even if we create our own fucking moral code, it's still like the big other which helps us live our life in virtue.
Oh yeah, because the thing is, like, I think sometimes, and I know Cadell was just talking with Murphy and Duan on this idea of psychoanalysis needs to get a more, you got to be careful that categories like negativity or positivity are not too rigid, right? Like there's a big other that is external from you, and then there's a big other that is your own internal work through non-rationality. Yeah, it kind of functions like a big other, but they're actually quite different. A big other that is a product of your own philosophical work to create this macro picture to kind of situate yourself in is very different from a big other that is out in the world that I just have to find, right? They both have formally the same structure, but they're actually different in how they operate. In the same way that there's a negativity that's good and there's a negativity that's bad. You can't just say negativity is good always or that it's bad. It always depends. It is always conditional. But since it is conditional, it is particular. And if it's particular, it requires attention, discernment, and art. And that's really hard. And the more and more you do that, the more and more to everyone around you, you're a crazy person. And when they tell you you're a crazy person, if you don't have that macro picture, you're probably not going to be able to hold it. And then you're falling into the Nash equilibria. It's just like, as a practical example, I do, obviously economics, business, entrepreneurship. I mean, it's extraordinary how the people around you will pressure you to make horrific financial decisions. And if you don't make it, they think you're wasting your life. And then here's the other thing. A lot of times there will be parts in your life where everyone around you will pressure you to make a decision. It's a bad decision, but then you start going, well, maybe it's okay. I don't know and you do it. Without that macro education and personal financing to solidify your personal decision, you're probably going to give in to what everyone else. And then 10 years later, you're going to be looking at your finances and being like, wow, I really don't like this situation. And all those people who pressured you and told you you were wasting your life, they're gone. They're not around anymore. You're just stuck with the decisions they pressured you in, and they're not here now. And that's basically the social dynamic in a nutshell all the time. The same with like we homeschool our kids. Why do we homeschool our kids? It's not because we're like religious and afraid of the school. It's because we're trying to create internal motivation. Like school operates in an extrinsic motivation, grading. There's a certain like age, you do algebra or math, you learn all this. We hate all of that stuff. We think it's dumb. The main thing we want to do is have our children be intrinsically motivated, where they find themselves wanting to read because that's just what you do, not because they have to read. It's just they want to do. We want to use like the key to, in our opinion, you know, a great way to teach kids to read on their own is comic books. Comic books are like a secret. You know, you give them the children's book with a few sentences, and then you give them like Snoopy, and then you give them Garfield. They will teach themselves how to read because comic books are a middle step between children's book, comic book, and then novel, right? So comic books, literally, you give a kid a comic book, they will go up in their room and on their own teach themselves how to read because they like the comic book, right? So we have different methodologies of teaching. Same with mathematics. We tend to teach, like we believe in foreign language. You know, they like Japanese or different things. So why are you doing this? Because you believe that the school system destroys external motivation. It makes them reliant on a grade, making the teacher happy, a big other. We want to remove the big other. We want them to be self-motivated in learning, to not think about learning as something you do to do a grade, but something you do because you're a human being, right? Everyone around accuses you of being a religious fanatic, or you're destroying their social life, or, you know, you're ruining their development, right? So you have to sit back and go through, no, they're wrong. But if you don't do that work and you read the books, you're probably going to cave. And then the funny thing is, like, what's crazy is that, you know, then all those people who are so adamant and big, like in my experience, a lot of the kids who actually go to school can't socialize. Like they're not able to interact with other ages, where our kids will just roll up on some 40-year-old and start talking. Like they don't care because they haven't been learned to care. They haven't been learned to self-select according to age and different things, right? But all those people who told me they were going to be awful at socialization, they're gone. They just changed the subject. Here's the other key. If you make a choice that is on your own, non-rational, that nobody understands, and then the fruits of that decision bear, you're never going to be acknowledged. The people who you went against, they're not going to come along and say you were right. They're just going to change the subject. They're just going to vanish. And so the only way to stick to that, because you're going to lose, you're not going to have social support, is basically philosophy, reading, learning, doing the work to have the macro picture to ground you, to have confidence. Otherwise, you're going to break to the day.
Yeah, that was a great example. I like the idea that from both sides there's actually a pain from being great and from perceiving greatness, right? Perceiving greatness, that's envy, what you talked about, and from being great is that you don't actually receive the recognition which you wanted for it. You're like, holy shit, look at what I did, and nobody's there to see. No one's there to see.
Oh, that's exactly right.
It's like incredibly hard to actually keep doing these great things.
Yep.
Because it's like, in a sense, so lonely.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the issue is that what has happened is the ability to receive recognition drops as you move into modernity and it becomes reliant on law. Whereas in, like we were saying with the Greeks or in a local community, if you were doing something like this, you wouldn't have everyone around you so readily attacking you because they would share the same givens of recognizing shine. Now, because the phenomenology of the celebrity and shine is not there, you don't get the recognition. So philosophy in a sense has to fill the gap. Philosophy, the right kind, thinking has to fill the gap to make you stick to what is shine and shining, even though nobody recognizes the shine.
Yeah.
That's the weird paradox now. You have to shine, know you're shining, even though it's not recognized. That's very bizarre. But that's what it takes now. And basically, when we're talking about what I would do, like I said, the probability of this is like 0. But at scale or spread, what I would do is transform the conditions of the classroom to increase the probability that people are able to recognize shine. Right now, they're not able to. And I really don't see basically any probability of addressing Dugan, Deleuze, all this stuff without increasing the probability of the average person to recognize shine. If that's not the case, then real transformation will not occur. It probably will not occur, okay, but at least knowing that then gives you confidence in your own individual life choices, right?
Yeah, a lot of sense. I have one question,
Please.
which is kind of in a different direction. So finish your thoughts and then we can...
Well, on the question you were also saying of additive, there is a way where you say, well, don't we have to add attention? So it's very important that we have the awareness of Illich, the attention of Simone Weil. I think Gurdjieff talks a lot about that. You know, there's this notion that at the end of the day, it all comes down to attention. You have to have the ability to give attention and awareness if we're even going to talk about shine, right? So the question is the following. Do you add attention, or is tension something that humans have that you need to subtract something getting in the way? Because if it is additive, then we're in huge trouble. You can't really add that. But what if it's more subtractive? As in, people now have something that is getting in the way of their capacity to give into attention. Well, that would be more doable, because then you're not trying to convince people of anything. You're trying to remove something they have. So you're not trying to add, you're trying to remove. And this is where we talk about the cell phone. You know, we talk about technology, we talk about fragmentation, distraction, all of these things of the funny way is what Bard calls the attentionalist economy is the end of attention. Like the attentionalist economy destroys attention. The moving into the city destroys attention. You know, the ability to focus on something is taken away. The removal of solitude, you know, there's no solitude, there's little silence. You know, you have a society of the inability to cultivate the attention. I do think that human beings have a capacity for attention. I definitely think some people are better at it than others, but I think there are things that can be done to subtract from people's lives that would give them better attention, thus increasing the probability of shine. Now, maybe not equally for everyone, but there are things that can be subtracted or shifted socially and then come what may, right? So all we can do at the end of the day is increase the probability of an outcome. We can never guarantee an outcome, right? So you can't, if you could add something, you could guarantee an outcome, because all we got to do is figure out what to add and we could do it. Well, the moment you guarantee it, you're a totalitarian. So you can't do that, right? You know, but if you start talking about, well, what do we remove to let people come forth in their own Heideggerian clearing, to let the being that's there come forth? Because Heidegger, toward the end of his career, is much more subtractive, much more annihilating, negation, all of these kind of languages, right? Well, that's a different ballgame. There are things that could be done there. And the key is where it may be possible to actually get social support at scale for something subtractive is that the majority of people seem to agree that there's a problem with social media. There's a problem with the cell phone. There is like a meaning crisis. There is a mental health crisis. Now, it depends on what we mean by meaning crisis, but if we mean by that some sort of inability to be motivated, that tends to be fairly agreed upon. And if you say yes, because there are certain relations to these technologies or one another, or because another reason that has destroyed attention is basically the inflation, because the cost of living has skyrocketed. And when you make it so expensive, people don't have time to focus because they have to get to the next thing. So there are socioeconomic conditions that are not so much additive but subtractive that could increase the probability of increased intention, therefore increase the probability of shine, inspiration, and so on and so forth. But of course, nothing is guaranteed. So I definitely think you are correct that if you're talking something additive, you're in trouble. If you're like there is something like in the class, we talk about being able to identify the dynamics of technology. Well, to be like a ninja at that, that's going to be more on the side of probably elite, additive, you know, doing some actual work. But if we're talking about a more general intuition of there being dynamics at play now that you don't have control over, that's more spreadable, right? And that is something that then you would pay attention to and say, hey, we need to avoid these dynamics so we can give more attention. If we can give attention, then we can recognize shine. We can recognize something that be a source of inspiration. So practically what that looks like is, for example, I will not be giving my children a smartphone. If they are 18 and they want a smartphone, fine. I'll give them a flip phone when they go on a trip. Like I hear this all the time. They're like, well, what if something bad happens and they need to reach it? They give them a flip phone. You don't need to give them a freaking smartphone. Like where did this whole jump to a smartphone? The problem is you as a parent need to identify differences between phones are good, but there's a radical difference between a smartphone and a freaking cell phone. Now, as an adult, say 28 or 25 or 20, you may need a smartphone for work. But here's the thing, a kid is not at work. They don't need a smartphone. You see what I'm saying? Like there are differences that you should pay attention to. You could need a smartphone if you are working in a corporation at 28, but here's the key. Because you're using the smartphone for work, it's bound. It's binded. You have a kind of reason to bind it. A child is going to encounter a cell phone as an infinite exploration of possibility. They're screwed. because then they're always going to the next thing. Where at least if you have work, you have a telos, you have a reason to use it, and reason always binds. Now, but that said, a lot of adults are more addicted. You know, everyone talks about the kids being addicted to the cell phones. There are lots of adults who are absolutely addicted, especially elderly people. And they're not paying attention to themselves because they're not, you know, self-critical. So even if you have a smartphone, regardless your age, you still need self-criticism to be paying attention to yourself. And you need to create your own dynamics. But the likelihood of a child doing that or having a reason to do that is insanely low versus an adult. But you have to be aware of those differences. You know, like we were saying in the course, if you're just going to be honest and say all technology is bad, okay, you don't have to discern, you don't have to worry about that, right? But if the question is, no, we want to use technology, but be smart about it, well, then you got to be able to discern all those particular differences. Well, that's what they used to basically call ethics. That was basically the discernment of virtue in Aristotle, the ability to judge the mean, to judge the kind of the middle, the golden mean. A virtuous person could judge the mean. They could judge the fitting. Like if you're virtuous, you're right. This is the funny thing. Classically, virtue and judgment were connected because the good was judging. That's what the good did. The presence of the good had a judging structure. So if you are virtuous, there's no separation between virtue and discerning. Like who cares if you're virtuous if you're not able to discern? You're probably just a good citizen. But are you virtuous? Not in the classical sense. A virtuous person can judge the mean. They can tell that no, there's a difference between a smartphone in the hands of a 32-year-old who has a job and in the hands of a 12-year-old that you gave to the 12-year-old because you as a parent were afraid something bad would happen. Well, in that second example, you're motivated in fear. You're giving an infinite device to someone who doesn't have a telos, and you're doing so in a world where attention and focus are primary. That's very bad. In the first example, for the 35-year-old, you're doing it from a practical work consideration, not anxiety. They have a telos involving work, and they're also an adult. Okay, those are very different. A virtuous person, and in many respects, virtue comes out in the shine of doing great. But you see, if you have shine, that means you discern doing something. This is the key. Like you had discernment to get to the capacity of sign. Like you discerned how to fight on the battlefield. You discerned how to rule, right? So you can't separate judging the good from being good, judging the mean from being the mean, judging the virtue from being the virtue. By separating those things, we're confused now. And we don't, and then we're just at the mercy of whatever the social dynamics are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a lot of sense. I also had this thought that when you appreciate, then you're also able to let it inspire you and you create. And so like those are inseparable actually.
Yep.
My question was, so last Sunday at the conversation, they mentioned fallenness as absent from panpsychism. And I haven't encountered this concept a lot, but at first glance, it seems like something as like the other side of pure difference, you know, just like negative difference, like instead of rising up to be greater, you sort of fall. But also like it doesn't seem to have a negative connotation. It seems to be something which is like inherently human, right? Or like something which Jesus represents, like God falling and into the flesh, right? So yeah, how do you think about fallenness? Like how does that relate to, you know, the growth of the subject or something like that?
Fallenness is a
And
concept.
also it must be related to rising up to the beauty and falling, right? So there seems to be like a lot here to do with fallenness.
There is, and so the term fallenness is kind of based on Genesis, eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then falling from Eden. Like you've fallen is kind of like a descent. You almost could situate it as exile, removal, no longer able to locate, and that's worded as a kind of fall. It's definitely a fall in the sense of you are in the supreme presence of truth, beauty, and goodness, ergo God. And now you have fallen out of the ability to encounter it without being killed. Because after Eden, very important, in Eden, Adam, which at the time was the name for both the man and the woman, it was not Adam and Eve until after the fall, which is actually, I think, important. But Adam could see God and not be killed. Well, once you get to Moses, if God shows up, you better hide in the cleft of the rock because you're going to be reduced to ash. So you could definitely associate, and actually I think this isn't talked about enough, the fall definitely situates some sort of ontological fall from the position to be able to experience full truth, beauty, and goodness to a place where you can't now without it being killed. You have to go through the process of sanctification, as you would call it, or this development of virtue, as we're saying. Most people are going to associate fall with sin in a kind of moral sense. You broke the law, therefore you've fallen and you're separated from God in different things. I think for me, fall and separation of God is correct. There's a kind of separation. But the fall I would want to locate in the idea that human beings start in understanding, and we do not naturally move to reason in Hegel. We start in naturally pursuing a big other, and we don't naturally negate, sublate that. Like, we naturally, as human beings, are in irony. That's what I want to emphasize. And what I mean by irony is that irony is when X does Y for Z, and Y is why X doesn't get Z. They do the very thing that they think is going to get them something, which is precisely why they don't get it. Like, we as human beings, as being fallen, means our very capacities to judge and make discernment or to determine good, beauty, and all that is off. It is off, not in the sense of it cannot be improved, but it does not start off improved. You do not naturally start off an expert at, say, judging virtue, for example. You start with a sense of virtue, and this is something like Aquinas would argue. He'd be like, you could say the difference between Protestants and Catholics, although I wouldn't push this too much because there's many Protestants who disagree with this characterization. But a Protestant would say that human beings lost the image and likeness of God, that they're totally depraved. At least a Calvin would say that. Where a Catholic would say, well, no, humans still, even in their fallenness, have the image of God. They just don't have the likeness. So in the Catholic conception, with the analogy of being, there's still an ontological connection with God. Where in the Protestant, no, there's no connection at all. It's a pure act of grace, and there's nothing human beings can do to improve. Now, there are plenty of Protestants who do not agree with that. I'm just speaking generally. And actually, there's a lot of Protestantism that's more Catholic in terms of an analogy of being. But if you just grant the characterization, the idea of image and likeness comes from Genesis 1:3, I think, where it says, man was made in the image and likeness of God. Most people take image and likeness as similes. I think that's a mistake. Image is ontology, likeness is accident. Image is essence, likeness is accident. So what you would say in the Catholic conception is that after fallenness, whereas in Eden, humans had both the image and the full likeness, they were like Christ, basically. That's why Christ is the second Adam. After the fall, they still have an ontological connection, but it's really, really weak, and it's really disordered, and it's not natural anymore, and we have to work at it. A child is able to say, I like this pizza. And Aquinas would say that feeling of like is the exact same feeling that as you mature, you're supposed to work and situate in the beatific vision. Like, the liking of the pizza is the very phenomenology that has to be trained through an unveiling process into the beatific vision. Likewise, the experience of envy is the very feeling that has to be, okay, that's a sinful take on it because you want to own, that has to be worked to the place of inspiration. And the reason why you can say that original feeling of liking pizza has a connection with the beatific vision is because you still have an ontological connection with God, because you still have the image. Therefore, it's possible for you to, in nature, have a feeling of the good that can be worked to the beatific, where the Protestant would be like, no, you can't, the liking of pizza has nothing to do with the beatific vision. The Catholic would say, no, it's on a gradient. It's just really far apart and takes a lot of work, right? So for me, I think the proper understanding of fallenness is that we start off liking pizza and have to somehow get liking pizza to the beatific vision. This is not natural. Also, the key to the fallenness model too is, for me, developmentalism, which is when you are a child, it is not bad for you to like a pizza and to associate that with beauty. But when you're 35, it is not good to do that, right? Like, there's an age thing. You start with the liking of pizza, and as a child, that's fitting, but it is not fitting as a 38-year-old to not be able to tell the difference between beauty and taste, for example. There are differences between these things. Now, the society conflates taste and beauty. Yes, beauty is a part of taste, but it's also not reducible to taste. Now, I have to argue that in the On Beauty paper. It's online, it's in the Fate of Beauty and different things, but there are distinctions between these that have to be, and you're supposed to mature with it. And if you don't mature with it, then you're not going to be following the analogy of being, the ability to follow being toward beingness, fullness, right? So that's how I think fallenness has to be understood. The issue with, so on the idea too, now here's the other critical component for the Catholic conception. The only way to move from pizza to Beatrice, let's say it that way because it sounds nice, is through an encounter of your own finitude. Because you're never going to think that pizza and Beatrice are different unless you come to the limits of yourself. Like when you as a child realize that, wait a minute, this is how it usually goes. If I have all the pizza I want, there's eventually a point where I don't want any more pizza because I'm full. Oh, well, wait a minute. Then pizza can't be fully good because there are conditions in which it's no longer good. Well, you've now hit the real. You've now been surprised. The key to the real is that the real has to be a surprise. The real has to, if you expect the real, then you absorb it into your symbolic and imaginary registers, right? So the real has to be a surprise. And I think there are differences between dusting and the real. But the problem is that the dusting, as Boothie talks about, like the dusting in the other person, when you encounter the other as an interiority you cannot access, the realness of that interiority as ontologically distinct only comes out in the real. So this is what's weird. Is the real is an ontological revelation, but it is not quite the same as the kind of dusting interiority, but it is always surprising and they're always linked together. But there's a distinction there that also needs to be brought out, because then what you understand is the real is the mechanism of advancement, which means it's a certain deconstruction. The child, when they eat,
so I didn't get the difference between dusting and the real.
So the dusting would be, for example, you as Jurij have an interior self that a consciousness I cannot access. But when I come into your presence, I know you have an interiority I cannot access, and that frightens me. Like I come upon the man in the woods, what Boothie was saying.
Yeah,
you see, the real is when we're talking for a while, I get really comfortable with your dusting. Oh, Jurij's great. He's really good. And we're talking for a bit. And then suddenly and all at once you say, you're an idiot, Daniel. That's the real. Like you have now surprised me with your dusting, right?
Yeah.
You know, because now it's come out. Now, the real is only possible, or you tell me that you don't like Final Fantasy VI, because that would be a real surprise, because that's the greatest RPG of all time, or Chrono Trigger or something, right? Or Street Fighter. You hate Street Fighter. That would be the real, because I'd be like, oh my gosh, how is it possible for someone to be awesome and not like Street Fighter? That would be the real. I'd be overwhelmed, right? So you see, so the real, the trick is that the real is only possible because of the dusting, but it is also an experientially distinct from the dusting. You understand what I'm saying? So, but here's the funny thing. The only way for advancement to occur from the child from pizza to Beatrice is actually the real. So then it's weird because the real is ontologically consequential, but the thing that is the ontology itself is not the real. That is, for say, in Catholicism, the analogy of being. For someone like Lacan, it's the dusting. There are different languages for it. But the only way, let's put it this way, the only way to advance in your relation to the dusting or the apophatic ribbon hole, as Cadell talks about in the subjects and subject, is through the real. Therefore, it's easy to ontologize the real, because the only way to advance in the dusting is according to hitting the real, thus making it seem like the real itself is the dusting, when instead it is the only way to make vivid and to change your relation to the dusting. That's where in Catholicism they talk about purgatory. The only way, and purgatory is not is supposed to be, I like how Cardinal Newman describes it, where purgatory is when, you know how earlier we were saying that the good is judging, when you encounter the good, it judges you? What Cardinal Newman says is when you take a bath, so that when you step in the presence of goodness, it doesn't overwhelm you so bad. Like when you encounter, like if you know you're going to go see the king, right? Don't you want to take a bath before you see the king? Don't you want to do that? That's what purgatory is for Cardinal Newman, where you actually go and clean off so that when you come before the king, it doesn't overwhelm you, right? Purgatory is not like a separate space or whatever. It's a process of purging like a bath. The reason why this is very important is because Cardinal Newman's conception of purgatory is the real. The real is actually the opportunity to take a bath. When you encounter, oh, people are different, they have different views, let me then go be the kind of person who can handle encountering difference, because that's what happens. When you find out there are people who don't like Final Fantasy VI, you then go, okay, I need to go and be able to handle someone telling me that and not show it on my face or not get mad at them. That's taking the bath, right? So then the kid finds out, oh, wait, there's a point where I don't like pizza anymore. Let me go learn how to like other foods, so that when I come back to the table and we're out of pizza, I don't throw a fit, or I'm not demanding my parents to get 20 pizzas thinking that's going to make me happy, right? So you go off, you change, and then you come back. And that mechanism of following an idea of what you believe is good until you saturate it, as Ebert says, which would be the point of the real, is then every encounter with the real kind of presents a choice. When you encounter the real, you're say, take a bath or not take a bath. If you don't take a bath, then you're probably going to be destroyed by Das Ding. That's the truth. Like the real is almost like a warning sign. It's like the real, hey, there's a Das Ding, you better go get your act together. And you say no. Well, then you're going to probably fall into the big other, undergo self-effacement and pathology. The real is actually a kind of gift. This is the joke. Like the real is kind of an opportunity. It's like a warning sign that says, hey, you're not ready for this. You need to go, you need to go get better, right? And then in that way, the real is grace. So likewise, the Catholic would say purgatory is grace, because purgatory is actually the opportunity to get cleaned off so that when you encounter Beatrice, she doesn't reduce you to ash like Lovecraft. Like you go through the process of changeling to handle more, and that would be unveiling in different things. And so for me, the proper understanding of fallenness is the reality that the only way to encounter more beauty without it being Lovecraft is through a gradual process of encountering the real. Like that is, for me, the proper understanding of fallenness, where you have to ascend through a gradual process of encounters with the real. You cannot avoid the real. If you avoid the real, you're a Pharisee. You're a religious Puritan. You're not sitting with the sinners like Jesus. That's the key. Like, why were the Pharisees so bad? Is because they tried to advance through God without the real. They tried to advance through God through purity. And yeah, Christ is not saying, to go off and, do a bunch of terrible things. But in the Jewish conception, purity had a lot to do with ritual baths, who you're hanging around, what you're doing, and different things. Well, all of those can help you avoid the real, right? Now, it depends on what Judaism you're talking about. Many Jews would disagree with this, but generally the argument in forms of Christianity is that what Jesus shows you is you have to sit with the real. Like you advance spiritually by going through the real, even to the point of death, right? That's the only way to encounter beauty. The beatific vision, if you try to get to the beatific vision, it's the great irony. It's the great flip. If you try to encounter, most people try to encounter the beatific, and even Christians now, because they have a terrible theology, honestly, is they try to encounter the beatific vision through purity, through never having an experience with the real. That makes them pathological. In my opinion, the proper understanding of Jesus, which is followed in the analogy of being, is that the only way to be able to handle the beautiful without it destroying you is through putting yourself in the place where you encounter the real. And you should never purify yourself from the real. By all means, purify yourself from, say, lying or something, like doing terrible things. That's fine. But there's a difference between the purity of immoral, like doing immoral things, theft and whatever, which are more legal, and that's how you get out of the inferno. But getting out of the inferno in Dante does not mean you've ascended the paradiso. Okay, you're not lying, you're not stealing, you're not murdering. That's good. That's good. You purified yourself legally, but you still got to get up to the beatific vision, and that means you got to go through the real. Now you got to sit with the tax collectors, right? That's the problem. Many, like Christians, have actually returned to a certain sort of, how do we avoid hell? And Jesus would say, well, that's good. That's good. But you haven't ascended to heaven. Just because you avoid hell doesn't mean you ascend to heaven. And that's actually like a funny thing, is many, and I know I'm speaking a lot of theology because I think it helps bring out the point. Most religious people today, in my opinion, assume that avoiding hell means you get into heaven. That's actually not necessarily the case. You see, you avoided hell. That's better than hell, but that doesn't mean you've ascended. And if you want to ascend from fallenness, let's say fallenness is laying on your back and then you stand up. That's good, but there's still a ladder now. You fell on your back, you fell off the ladder. Let's put it that way. You fell off the ladder, you're lying on your back, you stand up. Okay, you're out of hell, but you're not at the top of the ladder. Now you need to climb the ladder. Okay, and that means Beatrice now. Now you're ascending. Well, the only way to climb the ladder is through encountering the real. Like the experiences of sitting with the sinner, sitting with the tax collector, going through the cross, going through it. Like you can you can get out of hell and never encounter the real. All you got to do is the moral, right? But doing the moral doesn't mean you encounter the real necessarily. If you want to ascend in this more Beatrician way, then you must encounter the real, because that is precisely the process that habituates you to be able to handle more beauty without it reducing you to Lovecraft. And basically, you could say that my big critique of the general globalist social order in schools or whatever is it teaches people how to get out of hell, but it doesn't teach them how to ascend to the paradiso. And here's the issue. Beatrice says something very important in the Purgatories. He says, too fixed, warning that Dante isn't moving quick enough. If you stop moving, you start to regress. That would be the other argument of fallenness. There's no standing still. If you're not advancing, you're regressing. So the problem is, if you have a social order that's teaching people to get out of hell, but it's not teaching them how to advance in the Paradiso, then they're actually going to fall back into hell, actually. And that's where it's not so simple, where getting out of hell means you're good to go. Okay, you got out of hell, that's good, but you got to keep climbing the ladder. If not, you're eventually going to fall back down. Like, let's say if you're standing at the foot of that ladder, you stood up, if you just stand there, you're eventually going to lay back down because you're tired. You're going to lay back down and go back to sleep. So you fall back into the inferno. And that's basically what has occurred, because we don't have mechanisms of shine. Like the mechanism of which pulls people to Beatrice is shine. Well, we've lost that, right? So, and also to get it, Dante has to pay attention to Beatrice to be pulled forth, right? He has to have attention. He has to be able to focus. Well, if you don't have those things, you don't have shine and you don't have attention, well, then the best you can do is get out of hell and then eventually fall back in.
Yeah. So I think so what I hear here is that you are like the way I understand it is you're adding a teleology to Lacan, right? Like
Sure.
So like you when I watch Zizek on YouTube and he's like, oh yeah, embrace your alienation, whatever, love is so destructive, blah blah blah. Like there is actually no sense of optimism in him. And it's almost as if like he just takes marks and yeah, oh, that's optimism and that's like liberation or whatever. And like in reading Lacan, there's also like there's no sense of like, oh, he wants us to progressively, encounter the real blah 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 blah. He's just like there sitting and describing how these things work. And what you're talking about reminds me like this process of encountering the real continuously and letting it like making you face your own finitude, right? Like for me that's sort of the way I understand it is it's basically the beautiful soul, right? It's like, oh, the beautiful soul creates a mess in the world, blah blah blah, and then gets slapped in the face and it's like, oh, holy shit, yeah, look at this. And then you can like encounters its own finitude and then is able to sort of actually come closer to realer beauty, let's say, or something like that. So I think, and this relates what we were talking about earlier, ideas and experiences and how people only like learn from experiences. Like I think it's even so much to the point that there is no learning from ideas, and that only after you get burned you're able to see something. Like it's also what I put at the end of my presentation, like you have to wait till you're crushed before you can show or see your weakness, otherwise like you're just faking it. And like, well, so for me there's like almost this mechanistic view of things where it's practically impossible to see beyond your own projection until you get crushed. And in this sense, real is not like noumenal reality which bursts forth into your life, but it's actually just like a specific subset of your phenomenology which refers to that which crushes you. Yeah. So I wonder what you have to say about this idea of like teleology and progressively coming closer to some sort of beauty, because it rings true in my life, but also this sort of pessimism also has something that rings true as well.
Oh, sure. I think so. There's a few things. I think it's very important to not give the real necessarily an ontology, whereas it is a certain undermining of your phenomenology that then begs of you to make a choice. You have to make a choice of what that means and how you're going to respond to it. And the thing is, like, if you choose, for example, to say you can never get better, well, then the real will never force you to get better because you choose to interpret it in that way. So that, I'll talk about the absolute choice. Like you have to make an absolute choice. And that's why I don't want to locate the ontology in the real, even if there's something that the real is possible because of a certain ontology. Like the real would not
What
occur.
do you mean by locate the ontology in the real? What does it
Like,
mean?
so for example, like Lacan in the book Not Two talks a lot about this, on the idea of Lacan was very nervous about saying the real had certain ontological consequence, right? Like, so for example, if in a Christian conception, you would say, no, the real is not, like, the real in Lacan does not have substance in of itself. It is a result of the phenomenological irony of the human being stuck, having to operate according to what they think is good, even when it's not. And then they're surprised when it turns out there's a difference, right? None of that has substance, would be the term. What it is it is a result of interpretation. It's all in the realm of misinterpretation.
Yeah,
Well,
like the real is a situation. It's like the name to refer to some certain subset of your personal experiences. Like,
yes. I think for me, like Lacan, there's almost something about Lacan that has a kind of topiology, like it's a landscape description. It's a kind of topology, like how do you describe the experience of the human subject in relation to other people? I'm not sure if Lacan almost himself backs away from ontology, like backs away from saying that there's some sort of ontological ramifications for this. Now, the phenomenologist in me would say phenomenology is about asking the questions, what are the conditions necessary for these experiences to occur? It is not merely experience, like it's not just a simile for experience, although you could use it that way. That's not necessarily wrong for me, at least. But if it is possible for me to experience the real, which is a thwarting of my interpretation, which is necessarily tied to how I experience, because the whole reason you can make a wrong interpretation is because of how you experience the world to make that possible, right? Well, then that begs the question, what are the conditions of reality that make all of this possible, right? So that's where, for me, and now look, there's a lot of people who don't want anything to do with phenomenology who deal with psychoanalysis, right? They want to keep it there. But here's the problem. The reason why I think that's a problem is because then you might actually begin treating Lacan as an ontology without even realizing it. You start treating the real as ontological, like, and then it's an impossibility. The surprise itself has a substance that is not accessible. Well, yes, by definition, it's always a surprise. You can never predict it. Therefore, it's impossible to ever capture the real. Absolutely. But we're not in the business as a phenomenologist of capturing the real. No, we're in the business of responding to the real. You cannot progressively get better at making the real go away. Absolutely not. If it did, you could not be sanctified. The whole like it's actually a grace that the real is always there because it's always an opportunity to respond better, right? So you cannot progressively get rid of the real unless you're God, because then you know everything. If you're not God, then there's always surprise, and that's precisely why Dante can advance. But the key is it's not in advancing into the real, it's in advancing in response to the real, which is then in advancing according to the conditions of possibility that make the real possible as a topology, if you as a now.
you say that last sentence again?
The real is possible because of human experience. And all of Lacan psychoanalysis you could think of, I use the term topology, that I'm not saying that's a technically accurate word, but it's like the landscape of the human. The way the landscape of the human has something to do with the real, the imaginary, and it seems impossible to operate according to a different territory. Or map, even. It would actually, I should say map. But you see, if this is how we must experience, the question is, what are the conditions necessary for this map to exist? Well, there must be a territory that makes that possible. And what is that territory, right? That's then what you don't advance in the sense of making the real go away, but you can advance, for me at least, in your response to the real to be better at experiencing beauty. That's the beauty is more ontological than the real. But the way that you open yourself up to greater experiences of the beautiful is according to your responses to the real. That is precisely the opportunity to work on your responses so that you actually then meet a condition and conditionalism that is more able to undergo the beautiful. And that's how you can get a progress without ever progressing out of Lacan. Because that's, I think, the move that people are trying to hold to. They don't want to they're like, well, hold on, are you saying that we can escape Lacan? No. If you could escape Lacan, you couldn't climb the ladder of Beatrice anymore. Lacan is precisely the necessary condition that makes it possible to advance toward beauty. It's because you never escape the real that it is possible to advance. That's the tricky move for me, but I think it's very important. What happens is you say, we can never escape the real, therefore we can never advance. Well, those are different matters. The very impossibility of escaping the real could be why you could advance based on the ontology. That's the, like, that would be more of the kind of Christian conception. The very impossibility of escaping the real is precisely why it is possible to become more beautiful. Precisely because you can keep dying. Like if there was ever a point where you could stop dying, well, then you could no longer advance. You would be God, actually, right? And that's kind of I think the important move for me. And the reason why I think you need to kind of think these, because it just seems, one, it is evident in experience that humans can improve. Like it is obvious that humans can get better at things. Like when they can learn a language. They can start off angry, and as they get older, be more patient. We see this. This is true to experience. So when we say that it's impossible, the real is the impossible in the sense of it's impossible to get rid of, that cannot mean that no form of improvement is possible. It could mean that no completion is possible, okay, but it can't mean that no improvement is possible. Also, it's very obvious that kids can learn to read. They can learn to be literate. You can learn to appreciate art. It is very clear from experience that you can improve. So there's two options with Lacan. If Lacan is arguing that it's impossible for human beings, to improve at all in any way whatsoever, then Lacan is wrong, period. It doesn't pass the empirical test, right? But if Lacan is instead trying to map out an inescapable dimension of the subject, well, then Lacan could be true, but improvement could still be possible. So the question becomes the following: how can both of those be true? How can it be possible that there is an inescapable psychoanalytical topology or map, and yet humans also improve? How can we think those two things together? Well, we could argue that the very mechanism of the inability to escape the real is how people improve. Like that is the very condition of improvement, because what improves is not avoiding the real, but your response to the real. And that would be what I would argue. And that's how you get purgatory, Beatrice not smiling, all of these, Beatrice isn't smiling, that's the real. Yeah, and the very fact that there's a less smile means you can smile more, and that means you can advance. But that also is only possible because it's always possible for you to be destroyed. So to me, that's where, now, this is where you see a lot of, say, the Christian atheists or sort of Christians saying, oh, Lacan and all that is a really good description of fallenness, Peter Rollins, stuff like that. But to me, you have to move into the beautiful. You have to get into the classical conception of the analogy of being, because otherwise you're going to end up actually treating psychoanalysis as an ontology, or you could say like a full metaphysics, as opposed to a description of an inescapable map. Does it make sense of what I'm saying? Because this threading this, I think, is very important and very difficult. To say that humans can progress in terms of beauty does not mean they can progress out of the real, because the real is the very mechanism of improving in terms of beauty, because it is the ever opportunity to condition your response.
Yeah, this is how I was describing it to my girlfriend, and why I kept rambling on about psychoanalysis. Because she's like, oh, why are you treating like people cannot change, blah blah blah, and I'm like, this is the via negativa for change. Like,
Yes.
this is like, through the ways which you cannot change will allow you to see later the ways in which you can change.
Yes.
So like, yeah, I fully agree with you there. This is a great description, that like psychoanalysis is the structure of humans which is inescapable, but it does not make it an ontological truth. And treating it as an ontological truth makes us like reflexively influences our behavior, right? In a way which may not be favorable.
Yeah, because you have that macro, we were saying earlier, your macro picture infects your micro picture, right? Well, the same applies. Your ontology affects your phenomena. Like what you think is the underlying structure of reality affects you practically, right? So if you're not careful with Lacan, then you actually ontologize the inability to change. Well, then now we're talking determinism, basically, some sort of hard determinism. And you've now slipped into, unintentionally perhaps, a fatalism. And you don't even realize it. So for me, it's important to not let Lacan slip into fatalism, even though it's inescapable. Like inescapable and fatalism don't have to be similes. And that's the move that I think is important in Lacan.
Yeah, I fully agree. So, I mean, I have a question.
Please.
What is beauty?
The paper on that is an outstanding question. That is an absolute so this is the part where I'm a real dick and tell you to watch the conversation I just had with Thomas Jockin. There is a paper called On Beauty at OG Rose. There's also a paper called Aesthetics Then Ethics. Right. That's quite good. There's an entire book called The Fate of Beauty on this topic, on what beauty is. To put it, to say a lot that I'm not going to justify, is the beautiful is a recognition of the apophatic core of reality that is negentropic, that makes it possible for there to be a being that is entropic. And it is the increase of order in reality that when you recognize you yourself feel more ordered, that immediately bring forth a relation of love not in the possessive sit, but in the love of, this is what I appreciate. Hey, Cadell described it in his book as a river hole, where the subject has some sort of ability to be kind of an opening in reality in which increased energy is possible, the negentropic, as opposed to the entropic. That then also suggests the possibility of higher order, not in a totalitarian sense, but more like a dance or a flock of birds. Like it is an experience of an order that is not reducible to the immediacy of human cognition, but it suggests a revelation of the possibilities of reality that have not been fully realized, but can be fully realized. So beauty has an invitation to it that then calls on you to try to realize it. And it is the call of the subject to participate in the negentropic as a partial object. Thus it creates desire because it is not full, but it's a partial object as a primary substance, not a secondary substance, means as a particular individuality that then makes you want to participate in it. And the more you participate in it, the more as a feedback loop it works back on you to change that and then back and forth. So it becomes an unfolding creative act of possibilities that otherwise could not have been realized because you would have been stuck in entropy. So it is the universe in a way, to say something very, vague. Beauty are the points of negentropy in the universe, and it is found in the particular. It is found in the relation of the subject to the universe, and it is found in the ability of the human being to think thoughts. Like when I invent something, or I think of Moby Dick as Melville before it is written, there is no Moby Dick in the universe. It does not exist, and yet I am able to add it to the universe. Now, the moment I add it to the universe, it's entropic. It starts to fade away. And indeed, I'm only able to think of Moby Dick because I've seen things in the universe like a white whale, like a person. I'm taking the universe and reordering it in different ways. But what I reorder it as is then an example of how the things can be gathered together in a way that is not pre-existing. And then once that occurs, people can then choose to relate to it in different ways. So you increase the nexus of possible relations, possible interpretations that could inspire new things, so on and so on and so on. So the creative act then has a negentropic quality to it, as opposed to an entropic quality to it. And beauty is the experience of a reason to think that relating to this could be more negentropic than entropic. And that it is inviting you to relate, to explore the possibility of that horizon, to see what could occur. And it also creates desire in that very partiality because you want to see the rest of what could be there. Not to own it, not to have the fullness of it, but to keep going. Beauty is something, when you experience it, if it doesn't turn into envy, is something that you want the feeling of drive. The feeling of desiring, not desire of, but desire of desire, thus drive, and it keeps going. Beauty are the points of the universe that make you desiring, per se. It makes you drive, because it becomes negentropic and it pulls you into it, and you are changed by it, and yet you never fully exhaust it. So beauty then becomes something that emerges between the subject and the object, that unveils the entirety of a situation, that is not reducible to points, but is a metageometrical, to use Leibniz's term, experience that then suggests a certain fullness that the human can participate in realizing against the tendency of the universe to be more entropic into points. So beauty are the realization of the possibility to move from algebra to geometry, you could say, the possibility of the human to participate in a relation to what is going on, to actually make it fuller versus left, if they are active. This is the key. Beauty also summons a certain activity because you have to actively participate in this thing that you experience as beautiful. So you could look at beauty as the points, very, very vague, very, very general on what I'm saying. I do not believe that the universe is, say, doomed to entropy. in the sense, like a heat death. I think there's plenty of evidence to show that time is fundamental, like Lee Strobel or different things. There's plenty of evidence to show that the universe can unfold indefinitely. Yeah, sure, maybe it extends and kind of dilutes itself, but it is not clear to me that the universe must dilute itself or that it must kind of pull itself apart in the certain conceptions. Maybe it does, but it seems to me like it's optional, like that literally there's a radical freedom in the universe. Perhaps there's a 99.999% chance that in the end it ends in heat death, sure, but that 0.0001% is extremely important because it means that negentropy actually has a role, that it's actually there, and that there would be reason to think that the very experience of the subject able to think things that don't exist and recombine the universe in higher forms of order that are extremely improbable for the universe to create on its own, even though it's theoretically possible, would suggest there's a principle of adding order to the universe that can work against the entropy, even if it's ultimately doomed to fail or something like that. But the very possibility that could occur begs the question of what are the conditions of possibility in the universe itself to make it so possible that the human could add negentropy? Well, basically that would suggest, I think, that time is real, not just relative to space, that actually that space is a manifestation of time according to time space. The future is open in a radical sense, like the Hegel sense. Well, if the future is open in a radical sense, then you can't say it's doomed for a heat death. That's the problem. Like if you say, well, the universe doomed in a heat death. Okay, well, the future isn't radically open then. All right. There is a preset universe. Now, you could say, well, hold on. No, I'm just saying it's highly, highly probable. That's everything. The moment you move from fate to probability, you're saying that negentropy exists. You have to be, because otherwise it would be fated to collapse, right? Well, if negentropy is possible to some relative degree, then the question becomes, what is the condition of the increase of that possibility? Beauty is also critically temporal because it is an unfolding of time. When you see beauty, it's not a space, it's an invitation into a process. So it seems to be an invitation to the points of the universe that are part of the fundamental experience of time as something that Bergson would call duration versus sequence, whereas what lacks beauty is the sequence toward duration, to use Bergson's terms. Like what lacks beauty is entropy moving toward points of negentropy, which, by the way, there are some like Lee, Smolin, I guess Chetan was saying this. If the universe literally had no negentropy at all, it wouldn't exist. Like it wouldn't exist at all. There has to be some negentropy, maybe at the Big Bang, it doesn't matter, located anywhere you want. Negentropy has to exist to some degree if entropy is going to exist. Otherwise, the process would have never gotten going off the ground. Also, we would all just be dead because the processes of energy would not be restorable. There has to be restorable processes, right? And so the question becomes, what in the end will win? Well, again, you can say entropy will win. That's fine. But if you move it away from fatalism, you are saying that there are points, at least, of possible negentropy. And I would locate experiences of beauty as those actual moments of the supreme revelation of negentropy. But please, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah. So I mean, I have zero dog in the game of, oh, is freedom possible or not possible? Are we gonna die a heat death or not? I don't care. I'm human and I believe in freedom, and who gives a shit? But so like I'm wondering, so why is beauty related to order? I can like try to understand it intuitively and it can make sense, but isn't this like you know how we were, oh wow, this is just a fucking, fantasy of like, oh, this higher order thing, blah 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 blah. Like this, like because you can always say that something is higher order than something else, right? Like it's always like it doesn't really say much actually when you do that. Wait, I had a point. What? Yeah, you go ahead.
No, and what I would say is, I think this is very important, is that beauty as order is a intelligibility. Like it is not merely the arrangement of a pattern in a pleasing way. Although I would argue that is a form of beauty. It's like low, it's like eating pizza. It's like a very low form. When you see a pattern that has a certain sort of intention to it, then it tends to say, oh, it stands out to you versus a pattern that lacks intention, right? So the key is that beauty is order in the sense of order as intention. Intention. there's a certain sort of intention, as in your intention with it, and because it calls a response on you. And it always has a certain ordering principle because it orders you toward it. Like when you see something beautiful, you are then toward it. It stands out, it grabs you, and it screams and feels like a certain intention. It feels like it couldn't have been random. Like it had to have been there for some sort of intention. Now, that doesn't mean it was a design. It could have emerged, or it could have just been the right place at the right time. It actually could have been random, but it couldn't have been random in the sense of radically to the atomic level random. It had to have been that these things fitted together, even if they happen to come randomly. When they come together randomly, because of what they are in their randomness, it creates the experience of an intention because the pieces fit together that come together. And so that then is where you get in a feeling of a certain ordering. Because when you see it, you say, oh, those things must be ordered in such a way that they can come together to create this effect, even if it's random. And so there's a difference between the order of like law, legal order, and the sort of sense of fittingness, of things coming together, of things growing in their complexity. Like when you experience something beautiful, it also screams to you of a higher complexity. Like when you read Faulkner, you say, this is more complex than my child's stories or someone breaking a glass and throwing it on a sidewalk. When you experience glass on a sidewalk, it doesn't scream at you the complexity of Moby Dick or War and Peace by Tolstoy or a painting, right? Those things scream at you a certain intention, and in that intention, it invites you to determine the intention. Why did this happen? What are the conditions of possibility for it to occur? Because even if a bunch of random things come together that create a beautiful effect, you can still ask, what are the conditions of possibility of the universe to make this effect possible, even if there was no design, like conscious design behind it or different things, right? And that's then where you're starting to explore the ontology without trying to be dualistic, to escape experience. You're asking, what are the conditions that make this experience possible? And there has to be a certain ordering of things coming towards you in a certain order for you to have that experience. But it's not order in the sense of a rigidity. Like the weird thing is, you could say that beauty is the order of time. It's where time unveils a certain order, but it's the order more of like a plant. Do plants have an order? They do, but it's very different from the order of a building. Like there's an order that the seed goes to the plant and the movements of the roots. A tree has an order that is not really very predictable. And yet it is modelable. You can model what a tree is probably going to do, but you can't really predict everything it's going to do. But then when it does what you modeled, it was going to feel like you knew ahead of time, even though you didn't know exactly ahead of time. So I think sometimes the better way to think about the order of beauty is to think about plants, to think about trees, to think about like how plants grow in different things. There is an order to plants. When you see a plant, it has a certain order, but it is an order that unfolded from the seed. Like when you look at a rose, the petals all look very ordered, right? And yet it wasn't structured like a building. An order came out of a seed. That's more of what beauty is, where the universe unfolds in a way where you see an order and like, well, how the frick was that possible? Like likewise, the only way you could experience a rose is there were conditions of possibility to make a rose possible. And the experience of the order of the rose invites you to ask, what are the conditions of those possibility? And now you go and learn the seed. Now you go and learn how the seed operates, right? Well, when the universe does the same thing, then it begs the question of what were the conditions of possibility to make this experience of beauty possible? What was the order of things that had to unfold? What was the ordering of me that had to occur for this to be possible? And for me, it has to do with neotropic. Like it ultimately will require something neotropic. It will ultimately require that the universe has some sort of neotropic principle that is possible in its openness, that also seems to be uniquely intelligible to the subject. I'm not sure if I'm ready to say that it's not intelligible at all to the bear or the fox or the bird, but there is something about human consciousness that is able to make that thing intelligible. And here's the question with panpsychism. By all means, the conditions of possibility that make it possible for the consciousness to have this experience could be somehow fundamental. That's absolutely true. The issue I have with panpsychism is there's a conflation of consciousness being fundamental with all consciousness being connected. Those are actually not necessarily the same. They don't have to follow. Because what you're doing, like, do we think matter is all connected? In a way, it's all connected in so much as it's atoms. But when you start saying, well, there's some kind of like conscious connection, there's some sort of, collective consciousness, there's an intuitive, I think in Jung, there's like this deep subconscious that everyone shares that makes possible deep intuition. empathy being a connection of fields, and fields equals a connection of consciousness where we're all one kind of thing. That's very different. You know, if that would be something I would oppose and I would question, because the reason I would also oppose it is because it's not given an experience. The experience of consciousness is a radical individual, is a radical, like, my consciousness. I'm not in your point of view. I am stuck in mine. So the idea that consciousness at a certain fundamental level becomes pan. Now, again, people who know this field may say, Daniel, that's not what we mean by panpsychism, and that's fine. But the majority of panpsychics I meet absolutely believe in some sort of universal consciousness where everyone is connected in one. That is absolutely what the majority of people meet. Now, again, the majority of Christians also believe in very problematic ideas of the afterlife. For me, I would be more on the side of wanting to emphasize, in resurrection, death of the body, avoiding dualism and so on. So I'm not going to throw out all forms of panpsychism that may possibly exist based on the popular understanding. I leave open the possibility of someone to have an argument that consciousness is fundamental, even not universally connected in a vague, mystical way. We can have that conversation. And in fact, that could probably follow from the experience of beauty. But those are the arguments that need to be made. And this is the key point. I think the question of consciousness is tied to the experience deeply of beauty. Like, the conditions of possibility of beauty seem tied to consciousness as the realization of negentropy. Like, the realization of order, those things are tied together. Like, beauty inspires the subject to create negentropy. That's the case. Like, beauty, the experience of beauty has a certain summoning on the subject of consciousness to then make more of that. Okay, that's the negentropic function of the universe then. Like, it is in a dance with consciousness. Maybe it's, squirrels, octopuses, they can do it too. I'm not saying it's just humans that do this, but the experience of beauty is part of the inspiration against entropy. And this seems to be part of the universe itself. And so I would want to make ontological beauty. Like, beauty, I'm making ontological. Now, if you want to take it in a theological direction and say beauty is God, you can. I think there's room to do that, but I don't think you have to do that. That would be the absolute choice at the end of the day. There may be advantages to that. There may not be advantages to that. That would be the transition from philosophy to theology if you wanted to do. But regardless, whether you make that transition or not, I think you can make the argument that beauty is probably ontological in terms of the ordering of negentropy with a relation to a subject. That you could make ontological, because you could say the human, what is ontological is the consciousness and the subject that is summoned by beauty to create beauty or to participate in that ordering, right? That can be an ontological process, but then the process by which that is done is through the inescapability of the real. That's how you start making that becomes the inescapable process of which then you create negentropy in the tension with the real. Like, negentropy is a result of tension and fight and the use of energy and, like, getting better, right? That's why the real is necessary in all this, because you only create negentropy through struggle, basically, through difficulty. Like, that is where you then work through things to create a negentropy that is otherwise not there. So this is why the real becomes the inescapable necessary mechanism for improvements in terms of beauty, because you are only going to create negentropy in encounters with that difficulty. That is what summons it out of you. And then I would argue, basically, without beauty, you're not going to be able to, it's going to be very difficult without beauty to inspire yourself to rise to the occasion of the real. And that's when you then ontologize the real and say it's inescapable. The experience of beauty, and this is why I'm big on the creative act, art, honor, all of these different things we talk about, is when you remember experiences of the beauty, then you take the encounters of the real, not as a fatalistic, inescapable, but the occasion to get better at conditioning yourself to encounter the real. But the beautiful, but if you don't have those experiences of the beautiful, or this whole thing that we're describing is not so stitched out, well, then you ontologize the real. And once you do that, it's inescapable. And then it's entropy, right? And so to me, this is where what you want to ontologize, and I'll close with this. What you want to ontologize is the Leibniz situation of the universe having experiences of beauty in light of consciousness, rather human or animal, I don't know, I'm stuck in a human, that then summons you to try to rise to the occasion of that beauty, which requires you to encounter the friction of the real, that is the very tension that creates the negentropic energy that the experience of the beautiful motivates you to handle. And that becomes a kind of system in of its own right, a kind of process, almost like the oxygen, condensation, precipitation. That becomes kind of a cosmic system that then creates negentropy. And again, I'm not saying that animals can't do it as well, but it's clear that the human consciousness is perhaps unique in essence or quality. It doesn't matter. It's uniquely capable to participate in this system, even if all biology. So I'm not trying to say that humans are unique from animals, but they do seem better at it. But also in being better at it, that also means they're possible of being Lucifer. We're not going to see dolphins nuke the planet. Humans could, though. Precisely because they're able to participate in the system, like I was saying in the Dante presentation, it is possible for us to then really screw it up. Whereas a dolphin, maybe they also participate in this negentropic system to some degree we don't understand as human beings, but not as much. And precisely because it's not as much, they can't nuke us all, right? So increased capacity also makes possible increased destruction. So that's kind of the tension, right? So definitely to say humans are better at this is not necessarily to say humans are more valuable or better in a vague sense, because this very capacity is why we're able to make nukes or do things that could kill us all, right? So, I'm trying to avoid in that an anthropocentrism that is problematic, but that to me becomes the kind of system. I'm trying biological, eating plants die, all of that you could see cosmically, that talks about how beauty is tied to the metageometrical situation of negentropy that involves the subject. And metageometry is just Leibniz describing the geometry of invisible relations that are nevertheless real. Like when I'm talking to you right now, there is no my words are invisible. You don't see the relation, but it's very much there. So it's meta-geometrical. Whereas on a triangle, they touch. So it's geometrical, right? There is a geometry here, but it doesn't have the same principles of, say, a mathematical symbol and different things. So those would be some opening thoughts on the question of what is beauty. I think it gets into all of that.
So this last thing which you started talking about is actually what was on my mind. Because it seems that, actually, most, if not all of these conversations is not about sort of the noumena or the nodes, but about the relationships and situations. So what you're calling order is not like a thing which is there, but is like a certain situation which happens, a certain relationship which happens between, in my experience, or between you and me, or whatever. Or when we talk about the real, it's not like, oh, real is something. It's like, oh no, there's like these experiences, this set of experiences which we call the real. This is like this set of situations. And so maybe I'm asking more, I don't know if this is a question, but more of in a general sense. I think that these philosophical conversations tend to go in the direction of, let's say, observing patterns which were previously not obvious, right? And letting that influence us.
That's why for me phenomenology is central, because phenomenology is the recognitions of patterns, and then you ask what are the conditions necessary for these patterns to be possible. And if philosophy is not doing that, it is probably in trouble somehow. It's probably totalitarian, it's too additive. You've been saying a lot, and you're exactly right on the problem of additive structures. Philosophy must not be additive. It must be observant of what is occurring and asking about the conditions of possibility for that occurrence to be possible, which then, if you explain it, sounds additive because you're adding the explanation, but really what you're doing is tracing out why those conditions must be thus and making arguments for those conditions. You're not adding the conditions, you're trying to understand the conditions, because in our fallenness, the understanding of those conditions is not given by the experience. That's the problem. Experiences do not tell you the conditions necessary for their possibility. And so you have to think, in our fallenness, we have to earn an understanding of those conditions, which then is crazy, because how do you even begin to think about the conditions of possibility for experiences, in a sense, beneath the experiences, but not beneath them, in them? What the heck are we even talking about now? You lose your mind. And that's why philosophy has such a weird character. It's you're metaphorically trying to describe something that is utterly counter to experience. So when I ask you, where are the conditions of possibility of an experience located? Under, over, in, I don't know. We don't have language for it. So what we end up doing is philosophy then almost always takes on a circling structure, because no directional metaphor works. No language totally works, because it's ultimately a situation, and language is fundamentally sequential and linear. So philosophy has this kind of orbiting structure. And the reason it does is because you're trying to trace out a situation, not make a point. Good philosophy doesn't try to make a point. It tries to describe a situation and trace out that situation. Well, now it's a movement. It has a kind of moving structure then. But in that moving structure, movement by definition feels additive. It feels additional. It feels like you're going somewhere. So then it's like, well, then are we saying that people need to go somewhere? No, we're trying to move in the space we're actually located to understand what must already be already present, so we can understand how these experiences are coming forth, so we can relate to them better and do these things better that we already are doing. And that's the weird quality of philosophy. You have to do a lot of movement to do what you're already doing better. And you see, the issue is why I think it is important, though, to have some sort of doctrine of progress, is that otherwise, if you don't, why? Why would you do, why? So, and again, it's counter to experience. Utterly counter to experience that improvement doesn't exist. So again, it's very clear, the more you are able to understand the conditions of possibility, that has practical impact on your life. So for example, if you buy the argument that negentropy must exist, well, then you're not going to have one night when you're sipping bourbon saying in the end it's all a heat death, and you get depressed, and then you get mad at your wife because you're depressed, right? Like literally, it follows from that. If you say, no, actually there is a negentropy, maybe it's only 0.001%, and maybe the majority will screw it up and we'll all die, but there is hope. And so that alone, and then this is the key, that says, oh, well, you need to just toughen up and, not let face the facts. Well, one, are they facts? If they are facts, sure, we can face it, but there's also reason to believe that they're not facts. There could be more. But also, the human being, this is the funny thing. As I'm also defending an improvement, the improvement I am defending is one that is found in the sublation of a situation. The reason why that's really important is because I actually think human beings don't really improve that much, in the sense of, as an individual, if you feel hopeless, are you really going to be able to go then not treat your wife like crap? No. If you feel hopeless because people generally suck, you're probably going to be a dick. Okay, that you can never improve of. If we're talking the real of Lacan, that's right. That's an inescapable dimension. Human feels hopeless, human is dick. That's pretty much solid, right? Okay, so the only way then to improve is to not enter that situation. This is the key. You don't really improve as an individual, as an isolated individual, because we are kind of locked in a certain character and nature and phenomenology. But what you can improve is the situation, your relation to the entire environment that then works back on you. But it's not just individual willpower. It's found in a changing of your understanding of the conditions of possibility that then give you hope, so that you're not a dick. And that hope is not cheap. Because if you also just say, well, maybe, well, no, man, that's a cheap hope. That's not going to work. You need a costly hope, one you work for. Well, that means you need to do philosophy. So here's the thing. If you want a costly hope that then becomes a basis for a situation that then changes how you feel so you're not a dick to your wife, well, then you need to do the process of philosophy of having these really weird, obscure conversations to get an earned hope, as opposed to a dream fulfillment hope. This is the weird thing. Like this idea that it's all dream fulfillment, like hope and all those different, it probably is without philosophy. Absolutely. But with philosophy and finding plausible structures of understanding, then actually you can get hopes or different understandings of the universe that are earned. And if you're going to actually be solid in that, then you need that. Or it's only a matter of time, because human nature doesn't change so much that within 10 years you become a dick to your wife or something because you become hopeless. So it all connects. And that's where, again, what philosophy is in the business of doing is changing your understanding of situations, which then changes what you believe is the truth, which then changes you, that then changes how you treat people, the macro to the micro to the practical. And so that's why, to me, it's important to link the beauty to the Lacan. It's important to think the beauty in the real, and to think of improvement in terms of beauty, even if not improve, you can never improve out of the real, because that then changes how you feel on a Friday night, which then impacts your relation. And like Cadell has said many times, it doesn't take one or two bad interactions in a relationship to ruin everything, right? So the stakes are high. And that's also what they say, yeah, isn't it terrifying? Yes, but here's the key. You either take that terror to isolate and never interact with people, which you're probably going to do if you're a fatalist, or you're more likely to do as a fatalist. But if instead you say, no, there's improvement, then the very seriousness of the fragility of relationships, which is also the fragility of beauty, it's very hard to get something to be beautiful. That then means you spend a lot of time on it. And you have confidence that it's not a waste of time. And you spend a lot of time of getting better at the art and not thinking you're losing your mind as everyone around you tells you you're losing your mind. That's not really practical. Why are you doing those things? No, because of the kind of the idea of beauty in these things and the possibility of improvement, as everyone around you tells you that you're crazy and you're just a shaman and you're kind of losing it, you're able to hold to your confidence in that, work against the real, not become a fatalist, and in so doing all of that, you create a meta situation for your entire life that increases the probability on a Friday night you don't lose hope, so that you don't destroy your relationships, because they are fragile. But then it's precisely because they're fragile that if you improve in your capacity to hold them, that it's a miracle if you have them. Only miracles, only fragile things can be miracles. Only fragile things can be beautiful, because if they weren't, it wouldn't really be miraculous. It's the glass and the fragile that can have this kind of higher beauty. So the very fact that relationships can be so fragile is precisely why they can be so wonderful. The very fact that it is so hard to earn the conditions of experiencing beauty is why the experience of beauty is an invitation that is so exciting, or that feels so wonderful, and why the birth of negentropy as such in that meta situation is such a beautiful experience, because it could have not been, it could have broke, but it didn't. And there's something miraculous about that.
I would argue the opposite. They're hard because they're beautiful.
Yes.
Like I would causally put the arrow in a different direction, because if you say it's beautiful because it's hard, well, then a lot of difficult shit happens and it's not beautiful, right?
Sure. Sure. Well, but the issue is, like, it's hard to keep fragile things from breaking. Like, it takes a lot of like work to hold these things together. That's the key. Yeah. That's the key with beauty. That's why beauty is this miracle. Is like, it was hard and yet fragile and yet didn't break. Like, it's the paradoxical structure. This is also the key. Another way to look at it is, like we were trying to say the other day, where beauty in some way is higher than truth and goodness, and yet it particularizes and binds in that highness. Truth is a point. 2 + 2 = 4. Goodness is a point. You know, oh, that was good. I see it in separation of the context. But beauty is a situation. It kind of arises to this whole. It's not reducible to a point. So you go from point to situation. And a situation is this weird paradox, because a situation is pointless. Well, that doesn't make sense, because I'm experiencing meaning, but it's pointless. I'm experiencing something good, but it's pointless. Like, love is pointless. That doesn't make sense. Correct, because love is a situation. Friendship is pointless. Yes, correct, because it's a situation. Beauty is pointless. It's meaningless. The meaning crisis is exactly what you have to go through to get beauty, because you have to go through a meaning crisis to get to a situation. You have to lose meaning to actually open up to the fullness of situation. But a situation is a paradox, because it requires points to be constructed, but it's not reducible to the points, right? Like, the fragile things are hard. Well, that doesn't make sense. It's fragile. It's hard to hold a fragile thing. It's hard to make a fragile thing. And then, of course, the very fragility of it can summon out of you a reaction to treat it with more care, so it's more unlikely to break. You have all these paradoxical relations that can form. Basically, you're going to find the fullness of life in the places where these paradoxical A-B structures exist. If you're living a life where you don't have any, you know, what I use in the Hegel language, or the anthology is the A-B language. If you don't have any of that, you are probably not living negentropic. Like, the negentropic is found in the situation, in the A-B, where the hard and the fragile come together, where the love and the hate come together, where the joy and the beauty come together, the beauty and the piercing, where those things come together, because the beauty is precisely found in your mastering of the relation to those things, so that lovecraft is love. so that the fragile is hard to hold and actually more secure in its fragility, because in knowing it's fragile, you care about it more and you protect it more and you honor it more, as opposed to forget about it. Because when you forget, it's kind of funny, a lot of things that rust and destroy, they're indestructible, but precisely because they're indestructible, you forget about it, leave it in the rain, get rust, and it becomes useless, right? Whereas a painting, you hang that on the wall, you lock it, you give it a lot of protection, right? So these paradoxes, like you're saying, but it's the opposite. You made that very important move that you'll hear when you get into these, in my opinion, most critical issues of philosophy. When you get into the most critical issues of philosophy, there's always no, it's hate then love. No, it's love then hate. No, it's fragile then hard. It's had its part. That is precisely evidence you're dealing with a situation. That is precisely evidence you are dealing with a meta situation, not just a point. That's precisely where you're getting at real philosophy, because now the only way to deal with it is a human involvement. The only way you can have a paradox is the involvement of a subject. In the world, things are bookcase or not, right? If it is possible for something to be fragile and hard at the same time, that is only possible in a relation. Otherwise, it would be hard or be fragile. You see what I'm saying? So whenever in a philosophical discussion, you arrive at a question of what comes first, chicken or the egg, the chicken and the egg, it's a situation. There's an egg and a chicken it's a situation. You get an egg, so you get a chicken. There's not an ordering. The ordering is the situation. The moment you ask the ordering question, it automatically becomes impossible. The only way to keep a paradox from being a contradiction is a relation. Like, a paradox is not a contradiction. They're not simile. A paradox is the involvement of a relation that holds two opposing things together without effacing them. Right? It's a negation sublation is always a paradox, because you're holding things that are different together as a harmony, right? Well, there's only, as far as I know, there's only one thing that can do that: the human consciousness. The human subject is able to do that, to hold A, B together. Because even if you look at that bookcase, Hegel's whole point is the bookcase is passing into wood and it's always passing over, right? The experience of the passing over, though, is only done to a subject. Objects do not experience themselves passing over. The only way that the objects have an A-B structure to them is because of what? The relation with the subject. The relation with the subject creates the A passing over to B, the parts passing into the whole, the fragile passing into wholes. And then the key is the passing over. Here's the key. If there's a passing over phenomenology, then it is possible for entropy to pass over into negentropy. There's a possibility of things passing over into something else. So they're not determined. They undergo determinations, as Hegel would put it, but they are not determined in those determinations. They are necessary to have determination, shape, color, form, etc., so forth, but they are not determined by those determinations, because they can pass over in those determinations. And therefore, you can pass over from entropy to negentropy, back into entropy, back into negentropy. And beauty is the realization of the situation of that very realm of possibility, that horizon of possibility.
Yeah, I love that as putting beauty into the particular. Yeah. Listen, thank you for this.
Thank you, sir.
I will need to go soon.
I will too. I have to run to the venue, my friend. I have enjoyed it very much.